I had just sold my company for $31 million and was celebrating my retirement at my estate. Right before raising my glass to toast, I noticed something strange, a faint white residue on the rim of my whiskey glass. It was that very thing that made me suddenly remember my doctor's warning. From that morning, no alcohol while on antibiotics, or my heart could stop. I set the glass down. Minutes later, my son-in-law picked it up and drank it. What happened next changed everything I had ever known about my family, about the daughter I had loved more than anything. Welcome to our story. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. It's always amazing to see viewers from around the world. Also, please remember that some elements in this story are fictionalized for storytelling and learning purposes. I never expected my own daughter to try and bury me while I was still breathing, let alone at a party meant to celebrate my life's work. I, Thane Garrison, a 70-year-old retired mergers and acquisitions consultant who had built a $31 million empire out of corporate chaos, stood in the center of my Myers Park estate, watching my own retirement party with the detachment of a man who knew every celebratory toast had a price. The ballroom was a theater of my own making, lined with smooth mahogany walls and filled with the thick, heavy smell of expensive cigars. Men in three-piece suits leaned in to offer hollow congratulations, their eyes already scanning the room for the next person who could help them climb a little higher. 40 years of blood, sweat, and corporate warfare for one check, I thought as I adjusted the cufflink on my wrist. Wealth is the best revenge, but only if you live long enough to spend it. I had dismantled companies and rebuilt industries, always moving 3 steps ahead of the competition. Yet tonight, the air felt stagnant. Heavy with a humidity that had nothing to do with the North Carolina weather. $31 million. That's exactly how much my life was apparently worth to them. I watched the social climbers swarm the buffet, their laughter clinking like the ice in their crystal glasses, while I remained a ghost in my own victory lap. The detachment I felt wasn't new, but the sudden sharpness of my intuition was. In my business, survival meant noticing the twitch in a negotiator's jaw, or the slight hesitation before a signature. Tonight, every sense I possessed was screaming that the ledger was about to be closed. Jessamine Garrison Vance, my 39-year-old daughter, who managed a failing restoration firm and wore her late mother's elegance like a stolen garment, glided toward me with a tray of whiskey glasses and a smile that didn't reach her frantic eyes. She moved through the crowd with a practiced grace that looked forced her knuckles white against the silver tray. "Dad, you've earned this," she said as she reached me, her voice pitched in that high, brittle tone she used when she wanted something. "Let's toast to the end of an era. You look tired, Charles. You need to relax." She called me by my middle name, a soft intimacy she only used when she was playing the role of the doting caregiver. I looked at her, searching for the child I used to carry on my shoulders, but all I saw was a stranger in a designer dress. Have you ever looked at someone you love and realized they were measuring you for a casket? I reached for the glass she was insisting I take, my fingers brushing against the cold condensation. As I brought it closer, the bitter metallic scent of a faint white residue hit my nose, a ghost of a chemical that shouldn't have been in an 18-year-old scotch. I paused, noticing a specific jagged chip on the rim of the crystal. My mind trained for decades to find the flaw in the finest print, locked onto the irregularity. It was a small detail, the kind most would overlook in the heat of a celebration, but to me, it was a red flag on a contract. As I looked at that glass, I didn't see a toast. I saw the same tremor in her hands I'd seen in every desperate CEO I'd ever dismantled. The amber liquid swirled in the crystal, innocent to the eye, but my stomach did a slow, sickening roll as I remembered the cold finality of my doctor's voice just hours before. I realized then that the medical warning I had received wasn't just a precaution. It had provided Jessamine with the perfect cover for a natural death caused by a drug interaction. I froze, my hand hovering just inches from the glass she pressed toward me, while the sounds of the gala began to fade into a dull roar. The scent of the whiskey was sharp, but the metallic tang of fear in my mouth was sharper. I could almost hear the crinkle of the exam table paper from 8 o'clock this morning. Dr. Sterling Hayes, a man who had kept my heart beating through 3 decades of corporate stress, adjusted his spectacles and looked at me with a gravity that made the $31 million in my bank account feel like paperweight. The low hum of the office heart monitor had felt like a ticking clock as he reviewed the results of my blood work. He didn't offer a celebratory smile for my retirement. Instead, he smelled of antiseptic and grim news. "Your liver is screaming for a ceasefire. Thane, he had said, tapping a pen against the folder. These enzymes are off the charts. I'm putting you on a heavy course of antibiotics for that ear infection, but I need you to understand me. Not one drop of alcohol. He leaned in, his eyes boring into mine. Alcohol and these antibiotics don't just clash. They explode in your system. Why would a daughter ask for a detailed list of symptoms instead of wishing her father a speedy recovery? The question haunted me as I looked at Jessamine's expectant face. I recalled the phone call we shared at noon. I had explicitly informed her of the medical restriction, expecting a sigh of relief or a plan for sparkling cider. Instead, there was a strange static on the phone line as she went silent. Not even one glass, Dad. It's your big night, she had pushed. Are you absolutely sure? Then came the interrogation. She didn't ask how I felt. She asked what would happen if I slipped up. So if you did drink, the symptoms would look like... What exactly? Information is power. In Jessamine's hands, it was a scalpel. I told her the truth. Rapid heart rate, dizziness, respiratory failure. A heart attack in a bottle, the doctor had called it. In the middle of my own ballroom, the mahogany walls seemed to close in. The memory of her clinical curiosity now felt like a blueprint for a crime. If I died tonight with a glass in my hand, the paramedics would see a retired tycoon who couldn't resist one last toast despite his doctor's orders. It would be a tragedy, a foolish mistake, and most importantly, it would be unpunishable. She stood there, the tray trembling ever so slightly, her voice taking on a sharp, unnatural edge as she nudged the glass closer to my chest. Come on, Dad. Just a sip for the cameras. Everyone is watching. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Jessamine didn't just ignore my health. She had weaponized the doctor's orders to ensure her poison wouldn't be questioned. She wasn't asking out of concern. She was checking the calibration of her trap, and now she was leaning in to spring it. The snap of reality returned to the ballroom as I looked Jessamine in the eyes. In that blink of an eye, I stopped feeling like a victim and started treating my daughter as a corporate adversary to be outmaneuvered. I watched the liquid settle in the glass, my mind shifting from father to predator, as I prepared to close the most dangerous deal of my life. The vibration of the bass from the party music pulsed through the soles of my shoes, a rhythmic thumping that felt like a war drum. Jessamine stood there, the tray still trembling, her pupils dilated under the stinging heat of the ballroom lights. I've dismantled billion-dollar corporations, Jessamine. Did you think I wouldn't see the rust on your soul? The thought was cold and clinical. I moved my gaze from the glass to her face, deconstructing her performance with the same detachment I used to audit a failing firm. The forced pitch of her voice and the artificial floral scent of her perfume cloyed at me, smelling more like a funeral arrangement than a celebration. She was no longer my flesh and blood. She was a liability, a $31 million obstacle to be liquidated in the middle of a Myers Park gala. My throat felt dry, the air in the room suddenly too thin to support the weight of her betrayal. I had spent 40 years learning that the most dangerous person at the table is the one who has already decided your dead weight. A hostile takeover usually starts with a handshake and a lie. This one started with a chipped glass and a daughter's kiss. I looked past her shoulder at the sea of social climbers, wondering which of them were cheering for my fall. The slickness of the crystal glass, as my fingers brushed hers, was a tactile reminder of the stakes. I could have refused. I could have made a scene, shattered the glass on the marble floor, and called for the police. But 40 years in the acquisition business taught me that you never reveal your hand until the ink is dry. If I walked away now, I'd lose the tactical advantage of observation. I needed to know the depth of the rot. I forced a weary, appreciative smile to my lips, the kind of expression I'd used to put rivals at ease before the final strike. Thank you, sweetheart, I said, my voice steady and warm. You always did know exactly what I needed. As I took the glass, the cold condensation bit into my palm. 31 million. A high price for a soul, but Jessamine was selling hers at a discount. I watched the relief wash over her face, her shoulders dropping an inch as she believed she had successfully pushed me toward the edge. You look so much like your mother tonight. I added, the irony tasting like ash in my mouth. My fingers gripped the stem, securing the evidence of her intent. She smiled back, a hollow thing that made my skin crawl. I accepted the glass not because I was fooled, but to let the enemy think they'd already won. I let the doting father mask settle over my features, hiding the predator underneath. I took the glass, but I wasn't the prey she thought I was. I was the one setting the trap, and I was about to find out just how many people were in on the kill. The laughter in the ballroom sounded like glass, shattering, a sharp reminder that the only person in this house I could still trust was a 10-year-old girl hiding from her own parents. I moved through the crowd with the poisoned scotch still clutched in my palm, a steady weight that anchored me to reality. I needed to find Briar. I slipped away from the toxic perfumed heat of the main hall and eased into the quiet corridor that led to the estate library. The transition was immediate. The muffled thump of bass through the walls became a distant heartbeat, replaced by the comforting smell of old leather and dust. I pushed the heavy oak doors open just enough to slip inside. The library was a cavern of shadows lit only by a single lamp near the window. My granddaughter Briar Vance was tucked into a large leather armchair, her small frame nearly invisible against the dark upholstery. As I approached, she let out a sharp, ragged intake of breath. I watched her knuckles turn white as she tightened her grip on a thick black sketchbook, her eyes darting toward the door, as if expecting a strike. It wasn't just shyness. It was the hypervigilance of a soldier in a foxhole. "Hey there, little bird," I said softly, keeping my distance so as not to startle her further. Hiding from the vultures, too? She didn't relax, but her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "I just like the quiet, Grandpa," she whispered. "The quiet is safer." I moved closer, noticing the way she positioned the book to hide its contents. It was a tactical move one I'd seen in 1,000 boardrooms, but here in a 10-year-old, it broke my heart. Charcoal on paper. I'd seen balance sheets that looked less grim than this child's nightmare. I gently asked if I could see what she was working on, keeping my voice a low, soothing hum. Briar hesitated, her gaze flicking between me and the door, before she slowly opened the book. The drawing chilled me to the bone. It was a dark, towering figure with scribbled-out eyes standing over a small, trembling cub. They were surrounded by thorny vines that looked like barbed wire, thick and suffocating. "That's a lot of ink, Briar," I murmured, my strategic mind already cataloging the evidence. "Is that a cub in a cage?" She looked at the drawing, her face devoid of the innocence a child her age should possess. "The cub isn't in a cage, Grandpa," she said with a chilling flatness. "The cub is the cage." The realization hit me. Then Briar wasn't just documenting the fear in her home. She was living in a psychological prison I had been too busy with acquisitions to notice. Did you ever think about the secrets a child carries? They aren't weighted in pounds, they're weighted in silence. Suddenly, the library door swung open with a violent force. Jessamine entered, her eyes scanning the room with predatory efficiency. She saw the sketchbook and moved with a speed that was both graceful and terrifying. She snatched the book from Briar's hands before I could intervene. "Dad, don't encourage her." Jessamine snapped, her expensive sharp perfume stinging the air. "She's been far too sensitive lately." I saw the pure, unadulterated terror on Briar's face as she shrank into the chair. I was just looking at her work. "Jessamine," I said, "my voice ice. It's informative." Jessamine slammed the sketchbook shut, the sound echoing in the library like a gunshot. And for the first time, I saw the true face of the woman I'd raised. I left Briar alone in the shadows of the library, my hands balled into fists. But as I stepped back into the golden light of the hallway, I smoothed my expression into the mask of a man who had already forgotten what he'd seen. The sound of Jessamine slamming that sketchbook shut still rang in my ears, a brutal punctuation to the fear I had seen in my granddaughter's eyes. I had spent 40 years reading people like balance sheets, and I realized then that I had missed the most significant deficit in my own home. I navigated the hallway, moving with the measured stride of a retired tycoon, heading back toward the social noise of the bar area. I needed a non-alcoholic drink, or at least that was the story I would tell. I had already realized Jessamine didn't just pick a random glass earlier. She specifically sought out the chipped rim crystal I am known to prefer. It was a detail so small, so intimate, it proved the murder was meticulously premeditated. I found a spot near the heavy mahogany counter, positioning myself near a large, decorative gilded mirror. It was a relic Catherine had loved, and today it served as my tactical vantage point, providing a perfect, unobstructed view of the service area, while I appeared to be searching for a napkin. I watched Jessamine emerge from the corridor, shadows her eyes darting around the room with a sharp bird-like flick to ensure no one was monitoring her. "Just looking for a ginger ale, folks," I remarked to a passing couple with a practiced smile. "Retirement is a dry business, it seems." They laughed, oblivious to the predator standing behind them. I kept my eyes on the mirror's silvered surface. I saw the bartender turn his back, the heavy sound of ice hitting a metal bucket echoing through the air. In those 3 seconds of borrowed privacy, Jessamine moved. She reached into the lining of her clutch and pulled out a small glass vial. With practiced surgical precision, she emptied the clear liquid into the whiskey glass with the chipped rim, the one she had moved to the edge of the counter away from the others. Clear liquid, odorless, deadly. I had seen corporate poisons before, but never in a crystal tumbler held by my own flesh and blood. My own daughter was writing my obituary in silence, her face a mask of dutiful concern. "Don't worry about that one," I heard her say to the bartender as he turned back around. "I'll take it to my father myself." She turned from the bar, and for a split second I thought she had caught my gaze in the mirror. I quickly pivoted, pulling my phone from my pocket and pretending to be engrossed in a text message. Jessamine glided past me the air, following her, smelling of that same sharp, expensive perfume that now felt like the scent of a funeral. How many times had she rehearsed this moment in front of her vanity, in her dreams? "Oh, Dad, still working even on your big night?" she asked, her voice light and melodic. I didn't look up, immediately thumbing the screen. "Just a quick email, honey," I replied, my voice sounding far calmer than the blood drumming in my ears. "The world doesn't stop just because I do." She offered that porcelain smile and continued into the crowd, her confidence so absolute that she left the poison glass sitting unattended on the mahogany bar. She was certain my habit would lead me straight to it. The chipped glass sat there on the dark wood, the light catching the liquid inside, like a beckoning eye waiting for the man it was designed to kill. I watched the trap I hadn't set begin to close on a man who was never supposed to be the target, Sterling Vance. My son-in-law approached the bar with a face that was a sweating mask of anxiety. He didn't see me standing a few feet away. His eyes were glued to his phone, his thumb scrolling frantically through what I assumed were the latest foreclosure notices for his failing architecture firm. He looked aged, the confidence that usually defined his posture, replaced by a desperate, frantic energy. I moved toward the mahogany counter as calm as a summer morning and signaled for a ginger ale. With a deliberate, steady hand, I placed my glass on the coaster, right next to the poison-chipped whiskey tumbler Jessamine had left behind. It was a high-stakes shell game of crystal and toxins, a calculated risk that placed the decision in the hands of fate. Sterling barely looked up, his hand trembling as he shoved his phone into his pocket. "I need a drink," he muttered, his voice raspy and thin. "Now." I leaned against the bar, watching him, with the predatory vigilance I'd honed over decades of corporate warfare. "Careful, Sterling," I said softly. "Agitation and whiskey are a volatile mix." He didn't even acknowledge the warning. He just stared at the amber liquid as if it were the only thing that could save him from the ruin he had built for himself. A boisterous group of guests, laughing and fueled by the open bar, bumped into the edge of the counter. The sudden jostle created a momentary scramble, a blur of silk and perfume that obscured the line of sight. In that second of confusion, Sterling, too distracted by his inner collapse to look, reached out and grabbed the glass with the chipped rim. He didn't even look. He just drank. 20 years of architecting, and he couldn't see the structural failure of his own death. I watched with clinical detachment as he drained the liquid in a single desperate gulp. Strong stuff. He coughed, his face contorting as the bitterness hit his tongue. Bitter. I took a slow sip of my ginger ale, the bubbles cold against my throat. Some things are harder to swallow than others, wouldn't you agree? I watched the clock in my mind, counting the seconds. Does the poison care whose blood it burns? It's a tool, and tools don't have loyalty. Minutes later, the reaction began. Sterling's eyes glazed over, the frantic light in them, replaced by a vacant, terrifying stare. He clutched his throat, a low, wet sound escaping his lips. He stumbled away from the bar and into the great hall, his body beginning to jerk rhythmically as the toxins hit his nervous system. He hit the marble floor with a heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire house. The smell of spilled whiskey and the stinging scent of panic filled the air. Across the room, I saw Jessamine. Her glass of champagne shattered on the floor, the shards glinting like diamonds in the light. Sterling, no, no. Her scream was a visceral shock, the sound of a woman realizing her crime had claimed her partner instead of her victim. I stepped forward, my voice calm and authoritative amidst the rising chaos. "Someone call 911. I directed, my eyes meeting Jessamine's for a fraction of a second. It looks like a toxic reaction. The silence that followed Sterling's collapse was louder than any scream, but it was the look of pure, unadulterated horror on my daughter's face that told me the war had truly begun. The smell of antiseptic and industrial floor wax hit me like a physical blow, a sterile contrast to the scent of expensive whiskey and betrayal still clinging to my suit. The ambulance had screamed through the Charlotte night, a jagged blade of sound cutting through the silence of Myers Park. And now, I stood in the harsh glare of the emergency department at Carolina's medical center. Sterling had been whisked away behind double doors, his body a chaotic map of tremors and failing systems. I watched Jessamine through the metallic tang of the hospital air. She had collapsed into one of the cold plastic waiting room chairs, her frame shaking with what appeared to be uncontrollable sobs. It was a masterful performance, one I would have found moving if I hadn't seen the script being written in the library earlier. I sat in clinical silence, my spine rigid, observing the way she buried her face in her hands. I noticed then that her tears hadn't actually smudged her mascara. The black lines remained pristine, a clear indicator that her grief was a curated exhibit for the hospital's security cameras. "How could this happen, Dad?" she wailed, her voice echoing too perfectly against the linoleum. "He was fine one minute, and then he just fell. It's so unfair." I leaned back, my eyes fixed on the hum of the industrial HVAC system above us. "The world has a way of balancing the books when we least expect it." "Jessamine," I replied. My voice was a flat strategic instrument. I wasn't just her father anymore. I was a man watching a hostile takeover of the truth. "Have you ever watched a murderer check their makeup in the reflection of an ICU window?" I saw her do it when she thought I was looking at the television monitor. She was a predator in a silk dress adjusting her mask, while her husband fought for air only 30 feet away. We sat in that sterile purgatory for what felt like hours, the only sound the squeak of rubber-soled shoes from the passing nurses. Finally, a weary trauma specialist emerged. Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose eyes carried the fatigue of 1,000 lost causes, stepped into the light with a clipboard that held the chemical proof of my family's rot. He didn't offer a platitude. He looked at us with a gravity that suggested he was seeing something he couldn't quite explain. "We found traces of ricin in his system," he said, the words falling like lead. "This wasn't a heart attack. This was an intervention of chemistry." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Ricin Jessamine gasped, her eyes widening in a feigned shock that arrived a second too late. "Like from a plant that's impossible, ricin. A castor bean's final lethal revenge. And my daughter's signature." I watched her face closely. For a split second, the grieving wife mask slipped, entirely replaced by a jagged predatory calculation. She wasn't processing the horror of her husband's condition. She was processing the discovery of her weapon. Her next words stripped away the last of her disguise. Did they test anything else?" she asked, her voice tight with a sudden sharp fear. "Any other surfaces or containers?" She wasn't asking about Sterling's survival. She was checking the perimeter of her crime, terrified that the chipped glass was already in a lab. As the doctor turned away, I caught my daughter's gaze in the plexiglass reflection. She wasn't crying anymore. She was calculating the distance between the hospital and the evidence I'd already bagged. I gripped the steering wheel of my Jaguar so hard, the leather groaned, driving through the Charlotte rain, with the cold precision of a man who had finally stopped grieving and started counting. The long, silent drive back to the Myers Park estate was a necessary tactical retreat. Leaving Jessamine at the hospital under the pretext of getting some rest wasn't just for her benefit. It gave me a 3-hour window to scrub the house of any evidence she might have tried to hide. The drumming of rain on the roof provided a steady rhythmic cadence to my thoughts as I bypassed the glowing city lights for the darkened sanctuary of my property. I arrived at a dark, silent estate, the festive party debris now looking like the discarded aftermath of a battlefield. The smell of stale champagne and wilted lilies hung in the great hall, thick and cloying. I avoided the main lights, navigating by the dim emergency floor lamps. My first stop was the kitchen pantry, where I retrieved a pair of nitrile gloves. The snap of the latex against my wrists felt like the true beginning of the counter-offensive. I headed straight for the mahogany bar. There, sitting innocently among the half-empty tumblers, was the whiskey glass, with the telltale chip on the rim, the one Sterling had nearly died from. Habits are the easiest thing to weaponize, I thought, as I carefully lifted it. She knew I'd reach for the chip. It was a tactile comfort I'd had for years. I sealed the crystal into a Ziploc bag with clinical efficiency. Crystal, nitrile, evidence. My retirement party had officially become a cold case investigation. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor study, my footsteps creating a hollow echo on the marble. This was the room where I had spent 40 years orchestrating corporate takeovers, and now it would be the command center for my survival. I powered up my encrypted laptop, the blue light of the screen cutting through the darkness like a blade. I began the grim task of a digital audit, cross-referencing my personal gifts against Jessamine and Sterling's known lifestyle. Money is like blood. When it disappears this fast, there's a massive wound somewhere. I had funneled $200,000 their way in the last year alone, Yet as the records began to sync, a terrifying discrepancy emerged. In business, you follow the money. In a family, you follow the blood. Tonight, they were the same thing. Their credit accounts weren't just high, they were maxed out. Even worse, the mortgage on their home was flagging several months in arrears. I wasn't supporting a family, I was subsidizing a disaster. I leaned back, the chill of the room seeping into my bones. The audit was revealing a much darker picture than mere mismanagement. I discovered that the Vances didn't just spend the money I gave them. They had leveraged those gifts to take out secondary high-interest loans. Their debt wasn't a manageable sum. It was actually double what I had originally estimated. They were drowning, and I was the only life raft left, or rather my estate was. I clicked on the final tab of the credit report, my eyes narrowing as I scrutinized the most recent inquiries. The number that blinked back at me in red ink didn't just signify poverty, it signified a motive for murder. Every cent I had provided had been swallowed by a void I didn't yet understand. And the desperation required to hide a hole that deep was exactly the kind of fuel that led a daughter to poison her father's favorite glass. The red numbers on my screen didn't just represent debt. They were the cold mathematical proof that my daughter had appraised my life and found it worth less than a luxury mortgage. I sat in the pitch-black silence of my study, the only light coming from the blue-white flicker of the monitor. My eyes felt gritty, stinging with salt and exhaustion, but the strategic fury burning in my chest kept me upright. I began a granular descent into the genealogy of greed, pulling up a decade of bank statements and cross-referencing them against the ghost of Jessamyn's frantic voice. I remembered every emergency. There was the $80,000 I'd wired for a down payment on their house, the $60,000 for Briar's tuition shortfall, and the countless smaller injections for her boutique's expansion costs. As I mapped out over $200,000 in gifts, I realized the emergencies were mostly fabrications. The HVAC hadn't failed. The money had simply been funneled into Sterling's secret gambling accounts. I wasn't building a legacy, I was filling a bottomless pit. Every I love you, Dad had a transaction fee attached that I was only now beginning to calculate. I smelled the damp paper from the old records I'd pulled from the safe, the dry, stale taste of cold coffee lingering on my tongue. I realized that every time I showed fatherly love, they saw a successful withdrawal from an ATM that they now wanted to break open permanently. 24 hours. That was the remaining shelf life they had given me. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a countdown. I pushed deeper into the digital mire, finding a final hidden account under the name of Sterling's defunct architectural firm. This was the dark heart of the wound. I found a series of aggressive notices from a private lending syndicate loan sharks, masquerading as consultants with predatory interest rates. The final notice was dated January 15th, the day after my retirement party. It threatened irreversible action if $500,000 wasn't paid in full. My daughter didn't just want an inheritance. She wanted a bailout, and she was willing to pay for it with my blood. The chilling clarity of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. My retirement wasn't a celebration to them. It was their liquidation event. I wasn't a father to them anymore. I was just a line item on a debt sheet that needed to be balanced by an accidental death. I realized the date of the party had been chosen by Jessamyn specifically because it was the last possible day they could kill me to settle the deadline. If I were dead by morning, the life insurance and the estate would trigger just in time to stop the irreversible action. I closed the laptop and looked out at the rainy Myers Park Street, watching the droplets streak against the glass. I had spent 40 years believing I was the one making the moves, the one holding the leverage. Now, I saw that I was the mark. I stood up, my joints stiff, and realized that I was no longer a retiree sitting on a nest egg. I was a man living on borrowed time that I had to steal back from my own flesh and blood. At 6 a.m., my phone buzzed. Patricia Williams, the private investigator I'd hired yesterday, had already sent the first report, 3 offshore accounts in the Caymans, all opened 6 months ago under shell corporations tied to Sterling's defunct firm. The gray light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy curtains of my study, but it brought no warmth to the cold clarity of my discovery. I realized that night that debt isn't just a number on a page. It's a living, breathing shadow that had swallowed my daughter whole before she ever reached for that vial of ricin. I shifted in my chair, feeling the sharp stiffness in my neck from hours of hunching over the desk. The dry electronic heat rising from my laptop was the only warmth in the room, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the blue glow of the screen. I had spent my career navigating the deep waters of corporate finance, And now I use those same high-level credentials to bypass standard credit blocks, peeling back the layers of Jessamine and Sterling's life. What I found was a $650,000 sinkhole. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was a structural collapse. They weren't just living beyond their means. They were living on a tectonic fault line of their own making. I discovered a dizzying array of maxed-out high-interest cards and predatory personal loans from lenders I wouldn't trust to park my car. $650,000. I've seen multi-million-dollar companies liquidated for less. The luxury lifestyle I saw in Jessamine wasn't paid for by her boutique's modest profits, but by a predatory debt spiral that used my previous gifts as mere collateral for even larger, more dangerous gambles. Myers Park, granite countertops, and cathedral ceilings. It turns out you can build a very pretty cage out of unpaid invoices. My gaze fixed on the screen as I accessed the Mecklenburg County Public Records portal. The bitter, stale smell of my forgotten coffee sat heavy on my tongue. I scrolled through the recent legal filings, and there it was, the formal document that signaled the end of their charade. A final foreclosure notice on their residence was sitting in the digital queue. The bank had already scheduled the sheriff's sale for the following week. They were counting down the minutes to the auction, and I was the only thing standing between them and the street. I leaned back, my eyes burning. Every smile Jessamine had forced at the party, every doting touch was just a frantic attempt to keep the roof over their heads. My death was the only mathematical solution to keeping their front door from being padlocked. Foreclosure. The word sounded like a guillotine blade sliding into place in the quiet of the morning. Beyond the window, I heard the distant lonely chirp of the first morning bird, a sound that usually signaled a fresh start. But today it felt like a mocking alarm. I dug deeper into the dates of the filings, and a new chilling detail emerged from the data. Sterling had hidden the initial foreclosure notices from Jessamine for months, keeping the impending ruin a secret until the very last moment. It was only 4 weeks ago that she must have found out the truth. That realization likely triggered her final lethal decision to escalate from greed to murder. She had been backed into a corner by her own husband's lies, and then she turned that desperation toward me. I stared at the red notice of sale on my screen, realizing that Jessamine wasn't just a daughter I didn't recognize anymore. She was a cornered animal, with nowhere left to run but through me. The sunrise over Charlotte began to bleed a pale, sickly orange across the horizon, bringing light into my study, but offering no warmth to the situation. I stared at the red notice of sale on my screen, watching the dust motes dance in the harsh glare of the monitor. I didn't wait for business hours to call Patricia Williams. When someone tries to turn you into a corpse for profit, the concept of a polite wake-up call goes out the window. I reached for my phone, my fingertips feeling numb and cold despite the high-pitched whir of the laptop cooling fan. Patricia Williams, a private investigator whose voice sounded like gravel and expensive gin, had been my silent partner in a dozen corporate takedowns where the truth was hidden behind ironclad non-disclosures. She picked up on the third ring. "Patricia, I need to know who is betting on my heart stopping," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "I need you to dig into any life insurance policies issued in my name within the last 6 months. 6 months?" She repeated her scratchy early morning timbre, sharpening with interest. "That's a specific window, Thane. I'll have the underwriting trail by breakfast." I hung up and sat in the burgeoning light, the sharp, rhythmic tapping of my fingers on the mahogany desk, the only sound in the room. I discovered then that the insurance policy wasn't something Sterling had brokered in a back alley. It was a play Jessamine had made herself. She had used her legal standing as my primary caregiver to bypass the standard verification steps that would have flagged a man of my net worth. $500,000, the exact price of a daughter's soul in a Myers Park zip code. The wait was agonizing, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city waking up sounds that felt alien to the war room I had constructed in my home. 40 minutes later, an encrypted PDF arrived in my inbox. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, heavy rhythm. I opened the file to find a $500,000 term life policy from a boutique insurer naming Jessamine Garrison Vance as the sole beneficiary. I scrolled down past the fine print and the premium schedules until I hit the signature line. I felt a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline. It was a perfect imitation of my handwriting, the slight slant. The sharp loop of the G, a forgery so precise it could only have been crafted by someone who had spent a lifetime watching me sign checks. How many hours did she spend at her desk, pen in hand, tracing the loops of my name until she could kill me with a stroke of ink? The pixelated grain of the scanned document seemed to pulsate on the screen. She had practiced this. Between her furniture restorations and her mounting debt, she sat and learned how to become me on paper. $500,000. My death was literally her final business plan. But as I looked closer at the date on the forgery, a different kind of horror settled in my gut. The document was dated October 14th, the anniversary of my wife Catherine's death. Jessamine had chosen the day I was most vulnerable, the day I usually spent in silent reflection, to sign my death warrant. She hadn't just stolen my signature, she had spent months rehearsing the moment I would cease to exist, adding a layer of psychological cruelty to the theft that I never thought her capable of executing. The rising sun bleeding through the blinds of my study didn't bring warmth. It only illuminated the cold fact that I had been living with a 6-month countdown on my head, set by the very hands I used to hold as we walked to school. I leaned back in my chair, the grit of lack of sleep burning in my eyes, and began to process the timeline of the forgery. 6 months ago, the ink had hit the page. I pulled my digital calendar onto the screen, cross-referencing that date with my own movements. The realization hit me with a chilling clarity. That was the exact window when Jessamine had suddenly become the perfect daughter again. I recalled a series of heart-to-heart dinners and those unannounced weekend visits where she would sit in this very room, asking soft questions about my legacy and the specifics of my will. I had thought it was an act of reconnection, a daughter finally maturing into a sense of responsibility. I was wrong. Those weren't family visits, they were reconnaissance missions. She was here to gauge my health, and more importantly, to secure fresh signature samples. She had been confirming the loops and slants of my name before she committed the felony. 6 months of Sunday roasts and staged laughter while they waited for my pulse to fail. They didn't want a father. They wanted a mature bond to mature in their favor. 6 months. 180 days of fraudulent hugs. The dust motes dancing in the morning light seemed to mock me, floating through a silence in this house that now felt like a battlefield. My mind shifted the intellectual fury of a man betrayed, crystallizing into the sharp adrenaline of a corporate raider. I stood up from my desk, my palms feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of the mahogany. If they have spent half a year planning my end, I will spend the next 6 days ensuring their absolute ruin. I realized that the parental part of my brain, the part that wanted to protect, to forgive, to provide, was a liability. I had to amputate it to survive. You want to play the long game, Jessamine? I invented the rules you're trying to break. It was time to stop being a parent and start being the shark they forgot I was. I began to draft a counter-acquisition plan in my head, treating Jessamine and Sterling like a failing company that needed to be stripped of its assets. I had been the chairman of a board that was voting for my own execution behind my back, but they had made a fatal error in their projections. By waiting 6 months for the right moment to strike, they had inadvertently given me enough time to have automated my legal defenses. Years ago, I had set up a series of contingency triggers with Corbin Mercer, my longtime counsel. That would move my liquid assets into ironclad trusts the moment certain legal anomalies were detected. They were waiting for a heart attack to open the vault, not realizing I had already changed the locks from the inside. I felt a calculated resolve settle over me, a surgical coldness that removed the sting of the betrayal. They wanted to liquidate me for a bailout, but I was about to initiate a hostile takeover of my own family that would leave them with nothing but the debt they had cultivated. I reached for my phone to call Corbin Mercer, my heart no longer racing but beating with the steady, heavy thrum of a man who was about to finish a deal. The drive through the morning rush of uptown Charlotte was a cold, mechanical exercise. I watched the glass skyline reflect the rising sun, the jagged buildings looking like a row of teeth waiting to bite, but my mind was already deep in the basement of my estate planning, looking for the sharpest legal blades Corbin Mercer had in his arsenal. I moved with the steady, heavy thrum of a man initiating a hostile takeover of his own family. The Jaguar's engine purred under my hand, a civilized sound that masked the predatory intent coursing through my veins. I arrived at the Mercer Law Office precisely at 9. The space was the epitome of success, glass-walled, smelling of expensive leather and old law books. But today it felt like a war room. Corbin Mercer met me with his usual professional veneer, but it cracked when I placed the items on his mahogany desk. I laid out the evidence gathered during my sleepless night, the sealed Ziploc bag containing the chipped glass, the detailed digital audit of the $200,000 in gifts to Jessamine and Sterling, and the high-resolution scan of the forged life insurance policy. Corbin, a man who had navigated 1,000 corporate betrayals, went pale as he scrolled through the documents. Thane, this isn't just an inheritance dispute, he whispered, his voice shaking. This is a homicide investigation waiting for a body. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him with a surgical coldness. Then let's make sure the only thing that dies today is their access to my bank accounts. I revealed to him that I had already pre-signed the necessary transfer documents before leaving the house. I wasn't there to discuss options. I was there to execute a strike. $6 million, a fortune for most, a death warrant for my daughter. I sat back in the leather chair, the hum of the uptown traffic far below the window, providing a distant rhythmic soundtrack to the proceedings. I watched the blue light of the wire transfer screen reflect in Corbin's glasses. I gave him the order to restructure the primary trust immediately. I directed the move of $6 million, the exact sum I knew Jessamine had already allocated in her mind, to settle her looming gambling debts and foreclosure into a new restricted fund. I named it the Katherine Garrison Foundation after my late wife. In the boardroom, we call this a poison pill. In my family, the poison was already in the glass. I was just changing the prescription. This was a tactical maneuver, a tracking beacon disguised as a charitable act. I wanted to see how well Jessamine played the doting daughter when her projected rescue money was locked behind a charitable seal she couldn't penetrate. Corbin's fingers were steady as he clicked the mouse, the sound sharp in the quiet office. The fountain pen felt cold and smooth in my hand as I finalized the last of the paperwork. You're cornering a hungry wolf, Thane, Corbin warned, looking up from the monitor. Be ready for the snap. I knew he was right. I knew that Jessamine had likely set up illegal alerts to monitor my account balances. I was counting on it. I watched the transaction complete notification blink on the screen, knowing that somewhere across town, Jessamine's phone was about to tell her that her father was worth $6 million less than she'd planned. The bait was set, the trap was live, and I was just waiting for her to check the line. The drive back from Corbin's office felt like a tactical withdrawal, but my pulse didn't slow until I reached the familiar iron gates of my Myers Park estate. I pulled into my driveway to find 3 unmarked white vans waiting like ghosts at the gate, a silent army of technicians ready to turn my home into a fortress of glass and silicon. I needed this invisible net. I realized during the installation that this surveillance wasn't just to catch a crime in progress, but to provide a time-stamped, undeniable record of my own perfect mental competence. It was the only way to thwart the legal maneuvers I felt tightening around me like a garrote. The lead security technician, a man with the calloused hands of a tradesman and the hollow eyes of someone who had seen exactly what people did when they thought no one was looking, adjusted his tool belt and nodded toward the hidden lens. He moved with a quiet efficiency, the high-pitched whine of a power drill echoing through the great hall as he embedded tiny pinhole cameras into the molding. Smell of ozone and fresh plastic filled the air as cables were snaked behind the mahogany panels. Every room was being wired, the study, the bar area, even the hallways. These cameras are military-grade, Mr. Garrison, he whispered, tapping a cold, smooth tablet screen to show me a feed. You could see a spider crawl across the floor in total darkness. I watched the crystal-clear image of my own library and felt a grim satisfaction. I'm not looking for spiders, I told him. I'm looking for snakes. I had already informed the neighbors the work was due to a string of package thefts, but the truth was far more clinical. Electronic eyes, digital ears. My house was no longer a home. It was a trap with a high-definition lens. Every device was linked to a private cloud server that I alone could access a digital witness to my sanity. While the technicians worked, I retreated to the stale, recycled air of my study to conduct a deep dive into Sterling's recent business expenses. I was looking for a leak, and I found one that turned my blood to ice. There was a recurring $1,500 monthly fee paid to a Dr. Richard Steinberg. A quick search of the name revealed a terrifying reality. Steinberg wasn't a medical doctor for physical ailments. He was a geriatric psychiatrist known in elite circles for his cooperation in declaring wealthy elders mentally incompetent. How much does it cost to buy a doctor's signature on a commitment paper? $1,500 a month, it seemed. My own daughter and her husband hadn't just been waiting for me to die. They were building a cage for my mind while I was still very much inside it. Richard Steinberg was a hitman with a medical license and a prescription pad, and they had been paying his retainer for 3 months. This proved that the plan to seize my assets through legal incapacitation was the plan A that preceded the clumsy poisoning at the party. They weren't just trying to kill my body. They were preparing to execute my autonomy and erase my voice before I could even scream. I stared at the name Richard Steinberg on my screen, the metallic snap of a security panel closing in the hallway sounding like a cell door locking shut. They had been planning to lobotomize my legacy, and I was just now seeing the blueprint of the cage. The chime of the doorbell at 7 p.m. wasn't the sharp intrusion of an enemy, but the hesitant ring of a woman who carried the weight of her own son's sins like a lead shroud. I looked away from the monitor, where Dr. Richard Steinberg's name was still glowing in cold clinical blue, a digital reminder of the psychological cage my family was building for me. I stood up, my joints stiff from the hours spent in analytical fury, and walked to the door. Standing on the porch was Bernice Hayes, looking frail and pale after her recent discharge from the hospital. She looked like she had seen a ghost, or perhaps she was simply tired of living with one. I didn't want to bring her inside, where the new cameras might catch the tremor in her hands, so I led her to the garden bench. The smell of damp earth and late-blooming winter jasmine hung heavy in the evening air, a natural sweetness that felt alien in a week, defined by the metallic scent of betrayal. We sat on the rough texture of the stone garden bench, the distant hum of a plane crossing the Charlotte sky, the only sound between us for a long minute. "Bernice," I said gently, "you look exhausted." She didn't look at me, her gaze fixed on the dark silhouettes of the oaks. "Not a ghost," Thane, she whispered, her voice cracking. "I've seen the monsters I helped raise." She told me she hadn't slept for weeks, haunted by a conversation she overheard 2 months ago. She had been staying at the Vance house, and they thought she was napping in the guest room. Instead, she had been a silent witness in the hallway, while Sterling and Jessamine argued in the kitchen. Bernice revealed that Sterling had originally tried to back out, terrified of the risks, but Jessamine had coldly used Briar's future as a psychological lever to force his cooperation. Claiming I was hoarding a fortune I couldn't possibly spend. Hoarding, maturity date, asset. They weren't talking about a father. They were talking about a corporate bond. They discussed my retirement party as a liquidation event, a necessary business maneuver to satisfy the loan shark Sterling had brought to their door. They were counting my heartbeats like they were counting down a clock on a failing investment. My daughter had appraised my life and found it a nuisance. How do you tell a friend that her only son is a predator who sees your heartbeat as an inconvenience? I felt a devastating wave of betrayal, but it was anchored by the tactical confirmation I needed. Bernice's voice trembled as she recounted Jessamine's plan to use my medical condition as a smokescreen. "They weren't just waiting for me to die, Bernice," I said, my voice sounding like ground glass. "They were voting for it." I watched the catch in her breath as she fought back tears, her conscience finally breaking under the pressure of maternal loyalty versus moral truth. Bernice reached into her purse, her fingers fumbling with a clasp. She pulled out a small digital recorder, its surface cold and metallic in the moonlight. She hadn't just listened, she told me. She had been so afraid of what she was hearing that she had pressed record on a device she usually used for her grocery lists. Her eyes were filled with a terrifying resolve that told me she was ready to destroy her own son to save her soul. She handed the device to me, a silent pact formed in the shadows of the winter garden. I held the digital recorder like a loaded weapon, Jessamine's recorded voice cold, sharp, and hungry, vibrating against my palm as I prepared to dial her number and play the part of the dying lion. The audio from Bernice was a revelation of rot, a cold echo of my daughter's true intentions that made the fine mahogany of my study feel like a humid coffin. I listened to it one last time, hearing her dismiss my life as a mature bond ready for liquidation. It was the fuel I needed. I watched the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, counting down the seconds to 8 o'clock, the sound like a hammer hitting a nail. I took a deep breath, consciously loosening my vocal cords to find a dry, papery timbre. I wasn't just Thane Garrison, the M&A shark anymore. I was a confused old man reaching out for a lifeline. When I pressed the slick cold screen of my smartphone to my ear, my pulse was a steady predatory drum. I used Jessamine's own clinical symptom research against her, convincing her that the poison she intended for me, or perhaps just the crushing weight of my supposed health failure, was finally taking hold. "Jessamine," I said, when she answered, my voice thin and wavering. "I'm sorry to call so late, Where did I put those medical papers?" The silence on the other end was electric pregnant with a sudden dark hope. "Are you all right, Dad?" she asked, and I could almost see her leaning in toward the phone. "You sound a bit distant." I let a long, ragged pause hang in the air, the kind of silence that suggests a mind fraying at the edges. I told her I was feeling dizzy, that I was seeing spots and having trouble remembering the names of the firms I'd sold last month. It was a mirror of every symptom she had discussed with Doctor. Haze a customized lure designed specifically for her greed. Click, dial, lie. I was an M&A expert, and I was about to close the most hostile merger of my career. I could hear her breathing quicken, the sound of a shark that had just caught a scent of blood in the water. I think you were right, sweetheart. I continued, adding a slight tremor to my hands that translated into the phone's movement. I need someone younger around, someone I can trust to handle the big numbers. I'm scared of being alone in this big house with my head feeling so foggy. I suggested she bring over the power of attorney and those estate management files we'd discussed. And that Sunrise Gardens brochure you left on my desk last month, the luxury care facility with the $400,000 entry fee. Let's discuss that too. Her tone shifted instantly. The feigned daughterly concern evaporated, replaced by a barely suppressed predatory eagerness that set my teeth on edge. We'll be there first thing in the morning? Dad, she said, her voice now crisp and commanding. We'll take care of everything. Just stay put and don't try to move around too much. Do you hear that? That's the sound of a daughter believing she's finally inherited a fortune she hasn't earned. She thought she was rushing over to secure her future and lock me in the cage Richard Steinberg had built. What she didn't know was that I had already alerted Detective Morrison. He wouldn't be at the door. He'd be behind the mahogany, watching every move through the sharp electric blue light of the security monitors. I hung up the phone and looked at the screens glowing in the dark, knowing that by this time tomorrow, the only papers Jessamine would be signing would be her own confession. The sunrise over Myers Park arrived with a deceptive clarity, the light hitting the estate like a spotlight on a stage where the final act was about to begin. I smoothed the crisp edges of the power of attorney documents on my dining table, the paper feeling as cold and heavy as the bars of a jail cell I was about to walk my daughter into. I had spent 40 years closing deals, but this was the first time the price of success was a piece of my own soul. I watched the security feed on my tablet as Jessamine pulled into the driveway at 9 o'clock sharp. Her movements were frantic, a high-frequency vibration of greed that I could sense even through the digital screen. She entered the house alone, carrying a designer briefcase like a weapon, her heels clicking against the marble with a predatory rhythm. What she didn't know was that the documents she was carrying had already been compromised. Earlier that morning, Corbin Mercer had substituted the actual power of attorney files in her briefcase thanks to a silent intervention at her office with a comprehensive legal listing of her secret debts, gambling losses, and the forensic trail of the insurance forgery. I greeted her in my study, maintaining the foggy, distant persona I had practiced. My speech was slow, my eyes slightly unfocused as I led her to the dining room. I had positioned our chairs so the blinding sun reflected off the silver tea service, perfectly angling the light for the hidden cameras to capture every micro-expression on her face. "You look frail today, Dad," she said, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. "Let's get this over with so you can rest." I looked at her, seeing the stranger I had raised. "Frail," I whispered. "No, Jessamine. Just tired of carrying things that don't belong to me anymore." I watched her uncap her fountain pen, the scratch of the nib against the document sounding like a scavenger's claws. She slid the paper closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Sign here, Dad. Just your name, and I'll handle the rest." I reached for the pen, my hand trembling, not from confusion but from the cold satisfaction of watching her walk into the trap. The nib touched the paper. Pen, paper, poison. The three pillars of my daughter's inheritance. Just as she slid the paper toward me, the front door chimes shattered the heavy silence of the house. Lisa Morrison, a woman with the steady, unblinking eyes of a seasoned hunter, stepped into the room with the quiet authority of a person who had already won the argument. She wasn't alone. Two uniformed officers flanked her, their presence turning my dining room into a courtroom. Jessamine's face shifted from triumphant greed to a paralyzing gray terror as Morrison placed a cold clinical evidence bag on the table. Inside was the chipped glass I had secured. Beside it, she laid the toxicology report. "Mrs. Vance, you shouldn't have left your signature on the glass," Morrison said, her voice ice, "or your DNA on the rim. Have you ever seen a smile die in real time? It's a jagged, ugly thing." Jessamine lunged to her feet, the silver service rattling. "This is a mistake. My father is confused. He's not in his right mind." She screamed the lie until her voice broke, but the evidence on the table didn't blink. Morrison didn't just have the ricin report. She revealed that the lab had found Jessamine's own biological traces on the specific poisoned vessel. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the dining room was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in 40 years, but the look of pure, murderous hatred in Jessamine's eyes told me the deepest secrets were still buried. I sat in silence as they led her away, the house suddenly feeling hollow and vast. I stepped into the interrogation room, the heavy steel door thudding shut behind me, with a finality that signaled the end of the Garrison family as I had known it for 39 years. The harsh white glare of the overhead lights reflected off the industrial tabletop, casting Jessamine's face in a sickly spectral light. The cold metallic smell of the police station, a mixture of floor wax, old coffee, and institutional despair, clung to the air. Jessamine sat there, her expensive silk blouse wrinkled, her eyes darting like trapped birds. Even now, with the weight of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department descending upon her, she was attempting to play the victim of a grand misunderstanding. "Dad, you have to tell them you're confused," she whispered, her voice reaching for a pitch of daughterly concern that no longer existed. "This is all Sterling's fault. He was drowning in debt, and I was just trying to help him manage things. Your cognitive decline has made you paranoid, Charles. Please tell them." I sat across from her, my spine rigid, observing the way her fingers picked at the edge of the table. It was the same tell she had as a 6-year-old when she broke her mother's vase. "I've spent my life reading ledgers, Jessamine," I replied. My voice a flat strategic instrument. I know exactly when a partner has become a liability. I revealed to her then that my security cameras hadn't just watched the bar, they had recorded the encrypted phone calls she made from the library, including the specific instructions she gave to Dr. Steinberg about my commitment papers. Her denial faltered for a heartbeat, a jagged crack appearing in her porcelain mask. Inheritance. A word for the living to rob the dead. My daughter was just more impatient than most. She looked at me with a sudden sharp disgust, her fingers going still. I decided it was time to end the theater. I pulled the digital recorder Bernice gave me from my pocket and placed it on the table. The hum of the device as it powered on seemed to fill the room louder than the vibration of the heavy door locking. I pressed play. The scratchy sound of the argument between her and Sterling erupted in the small space. I heard her own voice, cold and hungry, dismissing me as an asset to be liquidated. "He's 70 sterling," she screamed from the speaker. "He's just sitting on $30 million while we lose everything. It's not murder, it's an early inheritance." Jessamine's face shifted into a frozen, jagged mask of pure, unadulterated greed. The mask of the grieving daughter was gone, replaced by the predator I had finally cornered. Have you ever heard your own child wish for your heart to stop in high-definition audio? You forgot that even in your own home, someone is always listening, I said. She didn't weep. She didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, she leaned across the table, her eyes burning with a murderous light. "Then you should be the one paying my legal fees," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "It's your money that put me here. It's only fair you use it to get me out." Her greed remained unbroken, a terminal disease of the soul that even handcuffs couldn't cure. I stood up and left the room, without a backward glance, the thud of the door behind me, sounding like the final period on a very long, tragic sentence. As I reached the hallway, Detective Morrison met me with a look that said the nightmare was only halfway over. The victory over Jessamine felt like ash in my mouth the moment I saw the grim tightening of Detective Morrison's jaw. She didn't look like a woman who had just closed a case, but like one who had just found a second body. I walked through the police station lobby, feeling the weight of the city on my shoulders, the hollow echo of my footsteps mocking the supposed triumph of the interrogation. I had just dismantled my daughter's life, yet the air felt heavier than before. Morrison caught up with me in the hallway, her expression masked in the kind of professional gravity that usually precedes a disaster. "He's awake, Thane," she said, her voice dropping to a low, cautious tone. "But he's not talking to us. He's refusing to cooperate with anyone but you. He says he has a final gift for his father-in-law." A surge of cold dread washed over me as we walked toward her car. A final gift from Sterling is usually an invoice I didn't ask for, or a lie wrapped in expensive silk. I discovered during the drive back to Atrium Health CMC that Sterling's silence wasn't born from some misplaced loyalty to my daughter. He had strategically clammed up to ensure that I was the only person present when he delivered his payload. He wanted the visceral pleasure of seeing my world shatter. The drive was a blur of gray Charlotte streets, my mind racing through a dozen corporate and personal betrayals, but none prepared me for the sterile purgatory of the hospital. ICU, beeps, tubes. A dying man's room, yet the only thing dead in there was my memory of a peaceful past. The smell of ozone and sour sweat clung to the small, cold room as I stepped inside. Sterling Vance lay partially paralyzed his body, a ruin of the man who had once glided through my house with unearned confidence. When he saw me, he laughed a dry, rattling sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. "You always thought you were the smartest man in the room." Thane, he whispered, his yellowed, sunken eyes fixed on mine with a terrifying intensity. "But I took your wife right under your nose." I felt the metallic taste of bile rising in my throat. "Catherine died of cancer." I snapped, my voice trembling with a sudden sharp defensive instinct. "You're lying just to hurt me because you lost." He didn't flinch. He just smiled, a twisted, jagged expression that distorted his pale features. His words were like slow-acting arsenic themselves, dissolving 19 years of grief into a sudden burning rage. He confessed then that her illness hadn't been an act of God, but a 6-month campaign of arsenic poisoning he had orchestrated with the clinical patience of a predator. He didn't do it for the money, not at first. It was a long-term psychological play to make Jessamine dependent on him, a way to isolate her by blaming me for not being there during her mother's final hours. He had built his marriage on the foundation of my wife's corpse. I stood there, the rhythmic mechanical hiss of the ventilator, the only thing keeping the silence from crushing me. Sterling leaned back against the thin hospital pillow, a jagged, paralyzed grin on his face, as he whispered the one detail about Catherine's final days that only her killer or her husband could possibly know. The Charlotte fog clung to the headstones like a cold, wet shroud, but the chill in my bones had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the fact that I was about to disturb my wife's peace to prove she'd been murdered by the man I'd welcomed into my home. I stood at the gates of Elmwood Cemetery watching the sky turn a bruised, sickly purple as the dawn struggled to pierce through the heavy mist. Standing in the biting January cold, I felt the numbing frost seep through the soles of my shoes, making my feet feel like blocks of lead. The crushing weight of the past had nearly broken me in that hospital hallway, but out here among the frost-covered granite headstones, it transformed into a sharp, crystalline resolve. Sterling's spiteful whisper in the ICU. That one detail about the hidden arsenic supply under the loose floorboard in the nursery hadn't just been a threat. It was a roadmap to his original sin. I stood in the silence, tasting the metallic, foggy air as the exhumation crew began their grim professional preparations. Detective Morrison stood beside me, her breath hitching in the frigid air. "We don't have to do this." "Thane," she said, her voice unusually soft for the setting. "You can wait in the car." I didn't look at her. I watched the yellow backhoe position itself over the Garrison family plot, its metal arm glinting under the pale light. "I let her die alone once because I believed a lie," I replied. "I'm staying until I see the truth." The grinding screech of the backhoe's metal arm suddenly ripped through the quiet of the graveyard. Thud, scoop, repeat. The sound of a past being unmade. I watched the pile of wet earth and damp pine needles grow the dark soil smelling of ancient rain and rot. With every bucket of dirt removed, I replayed those 6 months of Catherine's illness. I saw Sterling offering to bring her soup, his face the mask of a devoted saint. I remembered how he'd insisted on giving me a break from the caretaking, encouraging me to go to the office while he watched over her. I had thanked him for it. I had hugged the man who was loop by loop, day by day, ensuring the poison kept flowing into her system. 19 years of mourning a tragedy, only to find out it was an execution. Grief is a heavy thing, but it's nothing compared to the weight of the dirt that hides a secret. The heavy machinery eventually fell silent, replaced by the rhythmic scrape of hand shovels. I watched the professional mechanical movements of the crew, a sharp contrast to the beautiful floral funeral I'd held here nearly 2 decades ago. Morrison leaned in as the workers signaled they had reached the vault. She informed me that the coroner who handled Catherine's original autopsy had later lost his license for gross oversight and suspected tampering. The implication was a physical blow. Sterling hadn't just poisoned her, he'd likely ensured the medical records were as rigged as a hostile takeover. The crane groaned as it hoisted the silver-gray casket into the morning light. The sound was a visceral scream of rusted hinges and strained cables. I gripped my coat, my knuckles white as the casket was set on the grass. The coroner approached with a heavy tool, and as the latch gave way with a sickening hollow pop, I braced myself for the sight of the woman I'd failed to protect. I sat in that windowless room, the smell of industrial-grade bleach stinging my nostrils. while the modern world prepared to dismantle a 19-year-old lie with the clinical swipe of a laboratory slide. The transition from the foggy graveyard to the sterile consultation room at the Mecklenburg County Medical Examiner's office had been a blur of high-tension silence. I kept thinking about the silver-gray casket and the woman I had left inside it for nearly 2 decades, unaware that her peaceful rest was actually a crime scene. Corbin Mercer sat beside me, his presence a heavy legal anchor in the rising tide of my own guilt. The passage of time was marked only by the humming of the fluorescent lights above us, a sound so constant it began to feel like a physical pressure against my temples. We were waiting for the fast-tracked hair and bone sample analysis, the only things that could provide a forensic bridge to the truth. Corbin explained that the lab was looking for chronic arsenic exposure, a specific chemical signature that cancer simply could not mimic. Science doesn't have a bias. Thane, he said, his voice low and steady. It only has data. I looked at my hands, realizing they were shaking. I spent 2 decades blaming God for her cancer, I whispered. I should have been looking at the man holding the soup bowl. I realized then that Sterling's more recent plan with Dr. Steinberg was a hideous echo of the past. He was attempting to use psychological isolation now, just as he had used the slow-acting poison then, to keep Catherine away from the friends and family who might have saved her. Lethal. Systematic. Patient. My son-in-law was a farmer, and my wife was his harvest. The echoing click of Detective Morrison's heels on the tile announced her arrival before she even opened the door. She entered with a folder that felt like a tombstone, her face a mask of grim duty. She sat across from us, the sandpaper texture of the official report rasping against the table as she slid it toward me. "It's conclusive," she said, her unblinking eyes meeting mine. "Chronic arsenic poisoning. The lab found levels in the hair samples hundreds of times above the lethal threshold. He didn't just kill her, he tortured her for half a year. How do you breathe when you find out your life's greatest tragedy was actually a man's afternoon project?" The blinding white light of the room seemed to sharpen as the horror settled into my bones. Morrison informed me that the DA had already signed the warrant. Sterling Vance was being moved from his ICU bed to a secure prison ward, formally charged with the first-degree murder of Catherine Garrison. 19 years late, but the law finally caught up to his pulse. Morrison added a final detail that made the air in the room turn cold. The arsenic used was a rare industrial grade that matched the chemical supply company Sterling had worked for during his college years. An unbreakable chain of evidence he had likely forgotten was still waiting in the dark. I walked out of the coroner's office into the bright, unfeeling Charlotte sun, the sudden sharp coldness of my steering wheel, a reminder of the world that still moved around me. I knew Sterling would die in a cage, but as I reached my car, I realized the house he'd lived in for a decade still held his darkest secret. I turned the key in the lock of my daughter's front door, the click sounding like a deadbolt on a tomb, and stepped into a house that smelled of expensive candles and a decay that had nothing to do with physics. The silence in the Vance household was heavy, a suffocating pressure that made the sprawling, opulent living room feel like a museum of lost souls. Everything was perfectly staged, the granite countertops, the crown molding the designer pillows. It was the standard camouflage for a war zone, a pristine veneer hiding the structural collapse of a family. I stood in the entryway, my jaw tight, feeling the phantom presence of Sterling and Jessamine in every shadow. They were in custody now, but their rot still lingered in the air. I had come with a grim purpose to collect Briar's belongings and erase every trace of her parents' shadow from her environment. I was taking her out of here. Every thread, every toy, every memory that didn't deserve to survive. I moved toward the stairs, the hollow echo of my footsteps on the polished hardwood, sounding like a judgment. I entered Briar's room, where the blinding afternoon sun hid an empty white crib in the corner, a relic from her infancy that felt like a haunting reminder of how long this nightmare had been brewing. The room smelled of lavender laundry detergent and stale fear. As I began packing her sketches, I realized with a jolt of anger that Sterling hadn't just ignored her art. He had used her drawings to mock her weakness, proving he was the primary psychological aggressor in this gilded cage. Stickers, pink ink, blood stains, the anatomy of a childhood stolen. While reaching for a fallen charcoal pencil near her nightstand, I noticed a slight irregularity in the floorboards. I knelt, my joints complaining, and felt the rough splintered edge of a loose plank. Prying it up, I expected to find a child's trinkets or perhaps a hidden snack. Instead, I pulled out a small sticker-covered notebook with a rusted lock. I didn't hesitate. I forced the lock with a pocket knife and began to read. My heart broke with every turn of the crinkling pages. October 12th. Daddy hurt my arm for spilling juice. It still hurts. The handwriting was neat, clinical, a ledger of her own pain. I realized then that Sterling didn't just kill my wife. He had been systematically trying to kill this child's spirit for years. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that the monsters under her bed were actually the people who tucked her into it? My vision blurred with a protective rage I had never felt before, not even in the highest stakes of a corporate takeover. I turned a page and felt a fresh wave of nausea. The diary revealed that Jessamine didn't just fail to notice the abuse. She had witnessed it. She had sat there and told Briar that if the family lost the $31 million from my retirement, the punishments would only get worse. She had weaponized her own daughter's terror to ensure the girl remained a silent accomplice in their greed. I reached the back of the notebook and found a final devastating piece of evidence. I stared at a Polaroid Briar had tucked into the back, a photo of a jagged purple bruise on her shoulder that Sterling had signed with a sarcastic, "I love you," in black marker. I gripped the notebook so hard my knuckles turned white, realizing that while I had been managing empires, my own granddaughter had been surviving a war. The Polaroid of the bruise burned through the leather of my briefcase, a silent scream that I was bringing home to the one person who needed to know the war for her soul was finally over. I walked into my study where Briar was waiting. She sat on the edge of the large leather chair, looking guarded and small, her eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting a blow rather than a greeting. I didn't look at her with pity, but with the steady respect of a fellow survivor. I knew now exactly what she'd been enduring behind those closed doors. I gently placed the sticker-covered notebook, her secret diary, on the desk between us. The rough texture of the cover felt like a jagged piece of evidence against the people I had called family. "I found it, Briar," I said softly, "under the floorboard." She went rigid, her breath catching in a small hitching sound. Are you going to give it back to Daddy?" Her voice was a fragile thread of terror. I realized then that I had to move faster than the legal system. I told her right then that I had already filed for emergency sole custody using that very notebook as evidence. I explained that she was legally safe before she even stepped into this room, a revelation that made her small shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. No more markers, no more floorboards, no more fear. I knelt down to eye level, taking her cold, trembling hands in mine. I looked her directly in the eyes and validated every ounce of her pain. Spilling juice isn't a crime. Briar, I told her, my voice thick with a resolve that no $31 million deal could ever match. The monsters have been locked away. They are never coming back to hurt you. I saw the armor she had worn for a decade start to crack. "Grandpa," she whispered, "can I really stay without the black marker?" I felt a tear track down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. Before I reveal the detail that changes our future, are you still with me? Comment "stay" or "leave," and add one reason so I can see how you're reading this. Please note, what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what matters, because this is the moment where the Garrison name finally means something good. Forever Briar. I promise, my voice ringing with the weight of a permanent covenant. This house is your fortress now, and I will use every resource I have to ensure you never flinch again. I want to stay with you, Grandpa, she said, her voice finally breaking. Forever. For the first time, she let go of the sketchbook she usually clutched like a shield. She lunged forward, collapsing into my arms. Have you ever felt a child's weight settle into you? It's heavier than gold and twice as precious. She sobbed into my shoulder, a decade of stored terror finally leaking out of her and onto my suit. As I held her, Briar whispered the final horror Sterling had threatened to kill me, specifically if she ever spoke a word. Her silence hadn't been cowardice. It had been a sacrificial act of love for her grandfather. She cried until her small frame shook. But as I held her, I looked at the diary on my desk and knew my next visit wouldn't be to a lawyer, but to the woman who let this happen. I sat behind the reinforced glass, the ledger of Jessamine's betrayals resting on the small metal shelf like a tombstone for her greed. The county jail visitation room had a muffled, echoing acoustic that made every scrape of a chair sound like a gunshot. The air was thick with the smell of industrial floor wax and the stale, recycled breath of 1,000 desperate people. I waited, my pulse steady, feeling the cold weight of the sticker-covered diary in my memory. When the heavy steel door finally hummed open, Jessamine was let in. She looked disheveled, her designer poise replaced by a frantic, jagged energy that set my teeth on edge. She pressed her hands against the glass, leaving a cold, greasy smear where her forehead touched the surface. "Dad, you have to help me." She hissed, her voice a desperate rasp through the intercom. "You have to move the money from the shell account in the Caymans. If the feds freeze it before I can hire a defense team, I'm dead in here." I remained expressionless, watching her lips move. I had mapped her entire financial web while she was busy trying to bury me. I didn't interrupt her. I simply let her incriminate herself further, listening as she confirmed the exact details of the offshore accounts she believed were still her private sanctuary. "You were always so concerned about the accounts, Jessamine," I said, my voice cutting through her panic like a surgical blade. "Never about the child who lived in the house where they were kept." I watched her eyes flicker with a momentary confusion before the greed flooded back. "Thane, please," she begged. "Use the slush fund inheritance. Slush fund, slain." She was still speaking the language of a dealmaker while wearing an orange jumpsuit. I realized then that she hadn't just lost her way. She had built a highway toward my grave. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it against the glass. It was a legal notice invoking the Slayer rule, along with a full trust dissolution. I also shared a piece of irony that made her go pale. "I didn't just find your offshore account, Jessamine. I used that perfect forgery of my signature you practiced so hard to authorize a total transfer of the funds before the police could freeze them as evidence." I watched the realization sink in. I wasn't just taking her money, I was oxygenating the room and watching her realize she'd spent her last breath on a lie. "That $2 million account is empty." I told her, my tone one of supreme clinical triumph. "I've liquidated your safety net to pay for Briar's long-term therapy and an educational trust. She'll control when you're long forgotten. You can't do that." She screamed, her voice cracking as she clawed at the glass. "That's my inheritance." It was the last word of a predator who had lost her teeth. I wasn't finished. I informed her that, because of the physical abuse documented in Briar's diary, the black markers and the bruises you witnessed and used as leverage, I had successfully petitioned the court. "Your parental rights are terminated, Jessamine. You are officially a stranger to your daughter." I watched her mouth open in a silent, hollow wail, the reality of her total insolvency finally matching the poverty of her soul. I stood up and closed my briefcase with a sharp final snap. I walked toward the exit, the sound of her screaming my name and clawing at the glass fading behind me until there was nothing left but the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the vibration of the heavy steel doors locking me out of her life forever. The morning sun hit the Garrison estate looking like a clean slate. But as I prepared for the drive to the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, I knew the day would be anything but simple. I walked up the granite steps of the courthouse, the weight of the $31 million legacy finally feeling lighter than the truth I was about to lay bare before 12 strangers. The blinding flash of cameras in the hallway was a chaotic gauntlet, a media circus eager for the fall of the Garrison name. I kept my gaze fixed forward, leaning on the quiet professional presence of Corbin Mercer. Inside courtroom 402, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of old wood and floor wax. I took my seat in the front row of the gallery, the cold, hard texture of the wooden bench a grounding force. I watched as the defendants were led in, and the sight turned my stomach. Jessamine looked pale and diminished in her conservative suit, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Sterling was pushed in a wheelchair, appearing frail but wearing a look of defiant arrogance that made my blood run cold. I noticed immediately that they refused to look at each other. Even in the face of a life sentence, the predatory bond that had fueled their crimes had dissolved into a mutual legal loathing. They looked like a normal family, I thought. That is the most terrifying thing about them. Judge Holloway, a man whose face was etched with the weary lines of 30 years on the bench, peered over his spectacles with a gaze that felt like a moral weighing scale. He called the court to order the sound of his gavel cutting through the hum of the courtroom ventilation system. "This court is now in session," he announced. "Mr. Prosecutor, you may begin." 31 million, 2 murders, 1 family. The math of greed never adds up to anything but zero. I sat in a state of solemn anticipation, listening to the rhythmic tapping of the court reporter's keys as they recorded the beginning of the end. Lead prosecutor Marcus Vance stood and began a blistering opening statement. He didn't waste time with flowery rhetoric. He used a digital projector to display high-resolution images of the chipped poison glass that had nearly killed Sterling and was meant for me. Then came the side-by-side comparison of my actual signature against Jessamine's meticulously crafted forgery. A collective gasp rippled through the jury as the prosecutor described the calculated patience of the defendants, painting a picture of a 6-month campaign of domestic terror disguised as caregiving. "This wasn't a crime of passion, ladies and gentlemen," Marcus Vance declared, his voice rising with a controlled fury. "This was a hostile takeover of a human life." The prosecutor's voice was a scalpel peeling back the layers of Myers Park respectability to show the rot beneath. They didn't see a father or a mother-in-law. They saw a bank that wouldn't open fast enough. He paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the room like a shroud. Then he dropped the final volley of the morning. He revealed that the prosecution had secured a surprise witness, not just Bernice Hayes or myself, but a former employee of Sterling's architectural firm from 19 years ago, who had helped him procure the industrial-grade arsenic used to kill Catherine. As the prosecutor sat down, he turned toward the gallery and looked directly at me, his eyes promising that the worst of their secrets hadn't even been whispered yet. Then Bernice Hayes took the stand, her hands shaking as she held the digital recorder. The courtroom fell silent as she pressed play. Jessamyn's voice filled the room. "He's 70 sterling. He's just sitting on $30 million while we lose everything. It's not murder. It's an early inheritance." The jury's collective gasp was audible. The gavel didn't sound like justice. It sounded like the final nail in a coffin I'd been building for my own daughter since the moment I realized her love had a price tag. I sat in the front row of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, my spine rigid against the hard oak bench, watching the jury file back into the room. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and the desperate sweat of two people who had finally run out of exits. Sterling Vance sat in his wheelchair, his sunken eyes darting around the room with a feverish predatory intensity. When Judge Holloway began reading the sentence of life without parole for the first-degree murder of Catherine and the attempted murder of myself, Sterling didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a dry, rattling laugh that turned my blood to ice. He looked directly at me, a twisted smirk on his face, as if he regretted nothing but the fact that he hadn't finished the job 19 years ago. "Sterling Vance," the judge declared, his voice echoing with the weight of decades on the bench, "you are a predator who treated a family like a hunting ground. You will never walk free again." The biting cold of the handcuffs clicking shut on Sterling's wrists felt like a period at the end of a very long, bloody sentence. Then came Jessamyn, found guilty of conspiracy and solicitation, but having traded financial secrets for a lighter load, she was sentenced to 8 years in state prison. "Dad, please," she whispered, her eyes finally hollowed of the greed that had once fueled her every breath. I didn't answer. I watched the woman who was once my little girl being led away in chains, her designer heels clicking a final rhythmic retreat against the linoleum. 8 years for a daughter, life for a monster. The currency of the court is time, and I had just spent all of mine buying safety for the one person left who deserved it. I stood up, my knees popping from the months of sustained tension, and moved to the back of the room. Patricia Williams stood there guarding Breyer like a silent sentinel. I reached out and took the girl's small, trembling hand in my weathered palm. The small, warm pressure of her grip was the only thing that felt real in a world made of polished wood and legal jargon. Walking out of that building felt like surfacing for air after months of drowning in a swamp made of my own bloodline. We moved past the gallery of whispering spectators and through the heavy double doors into the hallway. "Don't look back, Breyer," I said, my voice low and steady. "There's nothing behind us but shadows." She looked up at me, her face pale, but her eyes searching mine for the truth. "Is it really over this time, Grandpa?" she asked. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "Forever." I had already ensured that the trust I set up for Jessamyn's eventual release was legally shackled. She wouldn't see a dime unless she maintained a permanent, distant silence from the girl I was now raising. It was my final financial shackle, a wall made of money to protect what remained of my heart. We reached the bottom step, and the blinding afternoon sun on the courthouse steps hit us with a sudden, unfeeling heat. The flashbulbs erupted like a sudden storm, a wall of white light and shouting voices. But I pulled Breyer closer, shielding her eyes from the world that had almost swallowed her whole. The iron gates of the estate swung shut with a heavy melodic chime, locking out the noise of the world, and leaving me in a silence that no longer felt like a vacuum, but a sanctuary. I drove the Jaguar slowly up the winding driveway, the crunch of gravel under the tires sounding like a rhythmic exhale. Beside me, Breyer sat with her hands folded in her lap, no longer trembling. The flashbulbs in the courtroom shouting were behind us, drifting away like the smoke of a fire that had finally been extinguished. I watched the soft, warm glow of the estate's exterior lights flicker to life against the deepening purple of the Charlotte sunset. We entered the house, and the ghosts of the past 19 years finally felt like they were beginning to dissipate. I followed Briar upstairs to her new room. I noted with a surge of quiet pride that she placed her sketchbook directly on top of the polished desk, rather than scanning the floorboards for a place to hide her soul. It was a small movement, but it signaled a massive shift. "Grandpa, can we plant something in the garden tomorrow?" she asked, looking out at the sprawling lawn. "Something that doesn't have thorns?" I leaned against the doorframe watching her. "We can plant an entire forest, Briar. Whatever you want." I realized that the $31 million legacy was no longer a target on my back or a weight in my hands. It was simply the fuel for a future where she would never have to flinch again. My desire for a companion through all of this hadn't been an attempt to replace Catherine, but a search for someone who understood the weight of the battle and chose to stand beside me regardless. No more lawyers, no more poison. Just the smell of damp earth and the promise of a morning without a trial. Later that evening, I walked down to the garden. Bernice Hayes was waiting at the gate, silhouetted against the fading orange and purple hues of the skyline. She was carrying a small pot of winter jasmine, the delicate, sweet scent already drifting toward me. We sat together on the cool, rough texture of the stone garden bench, the same spot where she had once delivered the news that shattered my world. The rhythmic, distant chirping of crickets was the only sound for a long time. I didn't come to apologize for Sterling again. "Thane," she said, her voice steady. "I came to see if the jasmine survived the frost." I looked at the dark earth at our feet. "It's a hardy plant, Bernice. Like us, it seems to thrive when the ground is hardest." We spoke for an hour about the heavy price of justice and the shared burden of being parents to people we no longer recognized as our own. Bernice's hand on mine was a different kind of contract, one signed in honesty rather than ink. I decided then that I would turn this entire estate into the Catherine Garrison Foundation's permanent headquarters. My home would no longer be a fortress of isolation, but a place that served those broken by the same greed that tried to kill me. As the sun dipped fully below the horizon, leaving only the soft glow of the moon, I looked back at the house and realized I wasn't just a survivor of a hostile takeover. I was finally the architect of a life that was actually worth living. The final morning sun hit the garden, illuminating the new growth that Bernice and Briar had spent weeks nurturing. I stood in the hallway, watching the morning light spill over Briar's easel, wondering if the colors she chose today would finally be brighter than the charcoal nightmares she used to hide under the floorboards. The sunroom was a sanctuary of blindingly bright light, reflecting off white walls, a stark contrast to the shadowy library where I had first seen her soul bleeding onto paper. Dr. Elena Vance, an art therapist with paint-stained cuticles and a voice that felt like warm wool, guided Briar's hand with the patience of someone who knew how to mend broken spirits one stroke at a time. I watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame, as the acrid yet promising smell of fresh acrylic paint filled my lungs. Instead of the frantic, jagged lines of her past sketches, Briar moved with a deliberate, calm fluidness. She was using vibrant ambers and deep oranges colors that seemed to pulse with life. I noticed something else that caught my breath. She was using the back pages of her old nightmare diary, the very ledger of her pain, to sketch plans for the new foundation's garden. She was literally turning her trauma into a blueprint for our future. "It doesn't have to be perfect, Briar," I heard Dr. Elena say softly. "It just has to be true." Briar dipped her brush into a glob of bright yellow. "I think I finally found the right shade of gold," she murmured. The soft scritch of the brush against the textured canvas was the only sound in the room, a peaceful rhythm that suggested the war inside her was finally reaching a truce. Amber, gold, ochre, a child's palette finally freed from the monochrome of fear. I watched as the session wound down, the sticky feel of paint on her fingers, becoming a badge of honor rather than a mess to be hidden. Briar set her palette down next to a cool glass of iced tea and turned to me, her eyes clear. "Want to see Grandpa?" she asked. I stepped closer, my heart hammering with a strange, hopeful anxiety. I expected an allegory of the past, but what I saw moved me to the core. On the canvas was a massive noble lion standing in a field of blooming jasmine. Its eyes were clear, protective, and unmistakably kind. "He's not scary, Grandpa," Briar said, sensing my shock. "He's just making sure the thorns don't come back." The canvas was more than fabric and pigment. It was the first contract I'd ever signed where the profit was measured in peace. "He's beautiful, Briar," I said, my voice thick with paternal connection I hadn't thought possible after so much rot. And he's never going anywhere. As I leaned in, I noticed a tiny detail Briar had painted around the lion's neck, a small, subtle gold locket. It was an exact replica of the one Catherine had worn every day of her life. Briar was merging my protection with her grandmother's memory, creating a lineage of love to replace the one of greed. She looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in years, the morning sun catching the flecks of gold in her own eyes. As she set her brush down for the final time, she asked the one question about the $31 million that I never expected to hear from a child who had seen so much theft. The image of the noble lion Briar had painted remained burned into my mind as I walked from the sunroom toward the study. It was a guardian, she had said, not a cage. I sat at my desk, the silence of the house no longer a heavy burden, but a hard-won peace, until I saw the manila envelope with the Department of Corrections return address sitting on my blotter like a fresh stain. The contrast was jarring. I had just witnessed the rebirth of a child's spirit, and here was the rot trying to claw its way back into the light. I picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of the cheap industrial prison paper inside. It smelled of sulfur and institutional desperation. Jessamine had written from her cell at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, and as I unfolded the rule-lined pages, I saw the dizzying mix of feigned repentance and blame-shifting I had come to expect. She claimed she was a victim of Sterling's influence, begging for just 1 hour to explain things for Briar's sake. I analyzed the handwriting, noting the same aggressive loops she had used when she forged my signature on that insurance policy. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for an audience for her next performance. I noticed a subtle pattern in the margin, a series of underlined words that formed a hidden code she'd used as a child to ask for extra allowance. Even in an orange jumpsuit, her primary focus remained my bank account. Blue ink, rule-lined paper, the livery of a convicted felon. I felt a dispassionate sense of finality as I reached for my phone. I didn't feel the burning rage that had sustained me during the trial, only a clinical necessity to protect the sanctuary I had built for Briar. I called Corbin Mercer, my voice steady and reflective. "Corbin, I want the wall higher," I said, watching a bead of cold condensation roll down my glass of water. "If a single letter reaches Briar, I'll consider it a breach of contract with your firm. It's already done, Thane," he replied, his voice a comforting gravel through the line. "The restraining order is ironclad. She's a ghost to that girl now." I hung up and picked up my fountain pen. I didn't write to Jessamine. I wrote a short 3-sentence response to her caseworker, formally declining all future contact and requesting that all further correspondence be returned to sender. The scratch of the nib on my high-quality stationery was the only sound in the room, save for the distant, cheerful birdsong coming from the garden. Closing this envelope felt like closing the lid on a hostile takeover bid that had finally run out of capital. I had spent a lifetime making deals, but this was the most important severance I would ever execute. I had even gone so far as to purchase the undeveloped land surrounding the prison facility through a shell company, ensuring no Vance-affiliated developers could ever set foot near that perimeter. It was a grand, expensive gesture of total containment, but peace has a high overhead. I stood up and walked to the corner of the office. The rhythmic mechanical whir of the paper shredder filled the room as I fed the manila envelope into its teeth. I watched the shredder turn her desperate words into confetti, realizing that while I had lost a daughter, I had finally gained the freedom to be the father Briar actually deserved. What is the true value of $31 million if it cannot buy back the years stolen by a lie, or the innocence of a child born into a den of wolves? I stood by the edge of the estate, my hand resting on the stone pillar where the Katherine Garrison Foundation plaque now caught the morning light. It was a clean slate, a cold piece of bronze that finally stood for something other than a target for greed. I walked back toward the house, my footsteps steady on the gravel, and entered the sun-drenched library to meet Corbin Mercer for our final legal signing. The room was warm, filled with the scent of old leather and the heady, sweet fragrance of blooming winter jasmine drifting through the open windows. Corbin sat at the mahogany table, his spectacles perched on his nose, waiting with the Briar Vance Irrevocable Protection Trust. I took my seat and picked up my gold-nibbed pen. The heavy, satisfying scratch of the nib against the parchment was the sound of a fortress being completed. I allocated $19 million specifically for Briar, structured with such multi-layered legal complexity that not even a rehabilitated Jessamine could touch a cent for the next 20 years. "This trust isn't just a bank account," Thane Corbin said, his voice low and clinical. "It's a wall built of ink and precedent, I want her to never know the weight of the gold, Corbin, I replied. Only the warmth of the sun it provides. I revealed to him then a final, aggressive clause. I had added a Slayer rule trigger that would immediately donate every remaining cent to the Foundation if any Vance-affiliated person even attempted to contest the guardianship. 19 million, a king's ransom, a child's peace. I signed the final page and felt a sudden profound lightness. After Corbin left, I took a glass of cold, crisp lemonade and walked out to the garden. The late summer sun was a golden weight on my shoulders as I found Briar sitting on the stone bench. She was humming a quiet rhythmic tune while she painted the jasmine we had planted with Bernice. "Look, Grandpa," she shouted, her face bright. "The jasmine is taller than my easel now." I sat beside her on the rough texture of the bench, watching her through the lens of a strategist who had finally won the only acquisition that ever mattered. "It's because the soil is finally clean, little bird," I said softly. I thought about the $12 million remaining in the Foundation, already being used to fund forensic audits for families of elderly abuse victims. My life's work had finally found its soul, and the wealth was finally serving its true purpose as a shield. Wealth is a blunt instrument in the wrong hands, but in the right ones, it's a lighthouse. I realized that by giving the money away to protect her, I had finally freed myself from being the prey my daughter saw. I had become a ghost in my own fortune, invisible and invincible. I sat on the stone bench and closed my eyes, the smell of jasmine filling my lungs and the distant sound of crickets providing a peaceful soundtrack to the afternoon. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a deal to close or a threat to manifest. I was just waiting for a life to begin. I looked in the mirror and realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't checking for signs of age or weakness, but wondering if a woman who had seen the worst of me could ever learn to love the rest. The face staring back at me was weathered, the lines around my eyes carved by 4 decades of corporate warfare and a year of domestic horror, but the predatory edge had finally softened. I adjusted my collar with steady hands. There was no poisoned scotch waiting for me tonight, no hidden recorders in my pockets. I was simply a man preparing for an evening out, a concept that felt as alien and exhilarating as my first multi-million-dollar acquisition. I arrived at the bistro, a quiet French establishment tucked away from the aggressive neon of Uptown, to meet Eleanor Hayes. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the first faint scent of a Charlotte September. I felt a strange youthful nervousness bubbling in my chest, realizing that while I could navigate a hostile takeover in my sleep, a first date at 70 was uncharted territory. Eleanor was already seated, the soft amber glow of candlelight reflecting in her eyes. "You're early, Thane," she said, a playful smile touching her lips. Old habits die hard. I took my seat, the smell of rich Cabernet and roasted garlic filling the space between us. "I spent too much time waiting for the wrong things," I replied, my voice low and honest. I didn't want to be late for something right. I realized then that Eleanor hadn't reached out to me merely because of our shared trauma with Sterling and Jessamine. She confessed that she had admired my strength from a distance for years, even during the decades when I was at my coldest and most calculated. Is it possible to feel 70 years of weight lift off your chest? Because of the way a woman tilts her head when she laughs. We spoke for hours, the muffled clink of silverware, and the low murmur of other voices providing a comfortable backdrop. We didn't dwell on the trial or the exhumation. Those were ghosts we had already exorcised. Instead, we talked about the autumn of our lives. We acknowledged the limited time we had left, without the bitterness that had once defined my every thought. We discussed what it meant to build a legacy that wasn't measured in bank balances, but in the hours of peace we could provide for Briar and for ourselves. "We're in the 4th quarter, Eleanor," I said, reaching for my glass. "I want to play it with someone who knows the score." She didn't flinch. She just looked at me with a profound, mature connection. "Then let's stop looking at the clock and start looking at each other," she whispered. "No poison, no ledgers, just 2 people and the truth." She revealed that she had been quietly working with Bernice to help other families in Myers Park recognize the signs of financial elder abuse. She had become a silent partner in my new mission before I had even thought to ask her. As I reached across the table to take her hand, her palm warm against mine, I realized that the $31 million hadn't saved me. It was the willingness to lose it all that finally allowed me to keep what mattered. The contract I was signing tonight wasn't for a company. It was for a future where my heart was finally allowed to beat for something other than survival. The morning sun reflected off the garden's new blooms, a vibrant display of life that seemed to dance in the cool breeze. I stood in the center of the redesigned ballroom, watching as the shadows of the past were systematically replaced by the bright, clean lines of a legacy that finally carried my wife's name with honor. The heavy velvet drapes that once absorbed the whispers of betrayal had been replaced by sheer linen, allowing the light to flood the space. I moved through the house with a sense of purpose that felt entirely different from the predatory vigilance I had once worn as armor. This was no longer just an estate. It was the headquarters of the Catherine Garrison Advocacy Foundation. I walked through the foundation wing, where the forensic accounting team and legal advocates were already a hive of purposeful activity. The cool, dry air of the filtered ventilation system hummed in the background as I met with Corbin Mercer. He looked up from a stack of files, a rare smile touching his lips. "We have 12 active investigations, Thane," he said, his voice ringing with legal finality. "The $12 million seed is already blooming into indictments across the state." I nodded, looking at the crisp, clean scent of fresh ink and expensive stationery on the desks. "It's not about the money anymore," Corbin, I replied. "It's about ensuring the next man like me doesn't have to become a predator to survive his own family." I revealed to him then a fact that gave me a grim sense of poetic justice. The foundation was primarily funded by the liquidated assets of Sterling Vance's defunct architectural firm. I had ensured the killer's own greed was being harvested to pay for the protection of others. Forensics, advocacy, justice. The new pillars of the Garrison name were being etched into the fabric of the city. As evening fell, the ballroom filled with Charlotte's elite for the official launch gala. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to my retirement party. The low hum of purposeful conversation replaced the frantic pretension of the past. I watched Eleanor Hayes and Bernice working the room, not as socialites, but as respected board members. Bernice leaned in as I passed. "They're listening, Thane," she whispered. "Not because you're rich, but because you're right." Eleanor caught my eye, her expression one of empowered solidarity. "Today we stop hiding the bruises," she said, her voice steady, "and we start naming the monsters." I looked around the room and discovered a startling truth through the mirror's edge. Several prominent guests weren't here for the wine. They were here because they suspected their own children were defrauding them. The foundation was an immediate high-demand necessity in a world built on silent theft. A foundation is only as strong as the concrete, and ours was poured from the ashes of a burned-down life. I felt the weight of my journey as I moved toward the stage. The blinding white light of the spotlights hit me as I stepped up. I gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, the microphone hum vibrating through my fingers like a heartbeat. I looked out into the eyes of the city, seeing the faces of donors and survivors alike. I realized then that I was no longer speaking as a victim or a man counting his shelf life in days. I was standing there as the executioner of a very specific type of evil, ready to give my inaugural speech. I smoothed the collar of Briar's new school uniform, my hands steady now, no longer the trembling claws of a man fighting for his life, but the calm support of a grandfather ensuring a future. The silence that fell over the room as I cleared my throat to speak at the gala last year had been the start of this long exhale, but today felt like the true completion of the cycle. I watched the morning sun glint off the white sunroom walls as Briar finished her breakfast. The table was clear. There was no sketchbook hidden under the edge, no frantic eyes scanning the room for an approaching shadow. Instead, she talked excitedly about her new art elective, her voice carrying a light melodic quality that had been buried for too long. "Do you think they'll have the good oil pastels?" Grandpa, she asked, her eyes bright with a curiosity that had finally replaced her hypervigilance. I smiled, reaching for a glass of cold, crisp lemonade. "If they don't, little bird, we'll make sure the foundation builds them a studio that does." I realized then that the heavy security I had installed, the cameras, the sensors, the vetted staff, had become a silent background hum. The lion was still there, but he no longer needed to roar to keep the perimeter safe. The air in the house was finally clean. Garrison, not Vance. A new name for a new soul. A few months ago, I had sat in Corbin Mercer's office and signed the final adoption papers, legally erasing the Vance name from Briar's records and permanently severing her from Jessamyn's toxic lineage. It was the best acquisition I had ever closed. We moved toward the car, the smell of leather seats and fresh notebook paper filling the interior. The drive to the school was peaceful, punctuated by the sound of other children laughing in the distance as we approached the prestigious academy. I watched Briar adjust her backpack, noting the absolute absence of the flinch that used to define her every movement. The $31 million hadn't bought this happiness, but it had bought the time and the high walls necessary for this single normal moment to exist. We reached the drop-off zone, and I felt a light breeze through the open window as I pulled the car to a halt. "Have a wonderful day, little bird," I said, my voice thick with a poignant closure. "The lion is right here if you need him." She paused her hand on the door handle and looked at me with a radiant clarity. "I know, Grandpa," she replied, "but I think I can walk this part on my own." The firm, reassuring click of the car door closing sounded like the final period on a tragic sentence. The backpack looked heavy on her shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the secrets she used to carry under her floorboards. As she walked toward the school's brick facade, she didn't look back to check for danger. She didn't look back to see if she was being followed. She looked back only once just before entering the heavy oak doors to give me a genuine radiant wave. I watched her disappear into her new life, her wave still echoing in my mind like a promise, and I finally let out the breath I'd been holding since the night of my retirement party. The war was over, and the house was finally a home. The study was silent, the air heavy with the scent of aged paper and the cedar logs waiting in the hearth, but the stack of envelopes on my desk hummed with a different kind of energy, the frantic, dying static of Sterling Vance. I had spent my day watching Briar walk into her new school with the confidence of a child who finally understood the sun was meant for her, not just for the shadows. That image remained my primary focus, a fortress of light that made the unopened legal correspondence from the state penitentiary look like nothing more than clutter. I sat in my high-backed chair, the same one where I had once sat, while poison coursed through my veins, and stared at the return address. Sterling was still reaching out, a man buried alive in a cage of his own, making clawing at the dirt. I realized from the sheer volume of the mail that he was attempting to use a desperate legal loophole claiming grandfathered visitation rights to reach out to Briar. The thought of his influence touching her life again, even through a piece of paper, prompted a cold surgical necessity within me. I examined the envelopes, recognizing the familiar aggressive tilt of the handwriting, a man still trying to dominate a room from behind bars. "You're still trying to close the deal?" Sterling, I thought, with a clinical detachment. But the market has moved on. I had spent decades deciphering his lies in boardrooms and at family dinners, but now his words had lost their power to poison my mind. Flame, ash, silence. The inventory of a dead man's influence. I struck a match, the sharp light illuminating the polished wood of my desk, before I moved to the fireplace. I began to feed the letters into the hearth one by one, without breaking the seals. I didn't need to read his justifications or his pleas. The blue-inked paper curled and blackened in the heat, reflecting against the glass of my bourbon as I took a slow, deliberate sip. The smell of burning cedar and singed paper filled the room, a cleansing aroma that felt like the final stage of a long-overdue renovation. I thought of Catherine and how she deserved a world without this man's shadow darkening her memory. Watching the ink melt into the embers was like watching a virus finally lose its host. As the fire consumed the stack, I felt no surge of anger, only a deep, cathartic sense of maintenance. "This isn't revenge," I whispered to the quiet room. "It's just maintenance." Among the curling remains, I caught sight of a return address from a private investigator Sterling must have hired, with some last reserve of hidden cash. It was a desperate attempt at blackmail, a final threat intended to overwrite my peace. I watched that evidence ignite too, rendering the threat powerless before it could even be spoken. The heat of the hearth warmed my face, as the last remnants of his influence turned to ash, leaving only the soft crackle of the wood. The last ember died in the grate, leaving the room in a perfect, untainted dark. But then the phone on my desk vibrated with a text that suggested my work in the light was just beginning. It was a message from the Foundation, a notification of a new lead in our reach across the state. I stood up, the silence no longer a burden, but a testament to a legacy that had finally found its soul. The soft glow of the smartphone screen in the darkened study illuminated the final chapter of a war I had been fighting since the night of my retirement party. It was a message from Detective Morrison, brief and clinical, yet it carried the weight of a divine decree. Sterling's final appeal had been denied. He would never leave the state psychiatric ward. I set the phone down, the blue light fading as I looked at the hearth where his lies had just turned to ash. I finally had the absolute closure needed to invite the morning light back into this house. The smell of roasted turkey and sage didn't just fill the hallways of the Garrison estate. It seemed to scrub away the lingering scent of clinical deception that had clung to these walls for far too long. I prepared the dining room for a small, intimate Thanksgiving dinner, a stark contrast to the hollow, aggressive galas of my past, where every smile was a transaction. Eleanor and Briar worked alongside me, our movements synchronized in a way that felt earned rather than staged. We set the mahogany table with the fine china, the clink of the plates sounding like a welcoming rhythm. When Bernice Hayes arrived, her presence was no longer a reminder of a crime, but a testament to the strength required to survive it. We gathered in the dining room, where the light was soft and the security cameras I'd once obsessed over were finally silent. I haven't sat at this table without checking the contents of my glass. In a very long time, I admitted pouring a deep oaky red wine. Eleanor reached out, covering my hand with hers. "Then let's make sure the only thing we're pouring today is gratitude," she said. "Pass the salt, pass the wine, pass the peace." We were finally speaking a language that didn't require a lawyer. Before I reveal the conversation that defined our meal, are you still with me? Comment trust or truth. And add one reason so I can see how you're reading this. Please note, the next part may not mirror real events exactly, as some details are adapted for storytelling. The purpose is reflection and learning. During the main course, the savory aroma of rosemary filled the air as the conversation turned toward the future of the foundation. We spoke openly about Jessamine and Sterling, not with the vitriol of the trial, but with the somber clarity of people who had moved beyond the reach of their shadows. Briar looked at me, her genuine unburdened smile brighter than the fire crackling in the nearby hearth. "Grandpa, is this what a real family feels like? Just talking?" she asked. I felt a lump form in my throat. "It's the only kind that lasts, Briar," I replied. "One where the truth isn't something we hide under the floorboards. Grief is a ghost that never quite leaves the house, but tonight it was just another guest sitting quietly in the corner, acknowledged but no longer in control." I realized that the $31 million hadn't created this moment, but my willingness to burn the old life to the ground did. Just as the meal concluded, Briar revealed she had been secretly painting a new portrait of us to hang in the entryway, officially replacing the old Garrison family painting she once feared. I raised my glass to the three women who had saved my soul, knowing that while the Garrison name was tarnished in the headlines, it was finally being polished to a mirror shine in the hearts of those at this table. The snow fell in heavy, silent flakes over Myers Park, covering the scars of the past year in a blanket of white that felt less like a burial and more like a clean slate. I stepped out onto the driveway, the biting cold of the winter air on my cheeks acting as a sharp reminder that I was still very much alive. A year ago, the first frost of winter had felt like a countdown to my own execution, a clean white sheet for the final chapter of a life I thought was already over. Today it was just the weather. I walked to the mailbox, the crunch of my boots on the fresh powder, the only sound in the quiet morning. Among the glossy advertisements and holiday flyers, I found a standard-issue prison holiday card. It was addressed in Jessamine's now trembling hand, a script that had lost the sharp, aggressive loops of her former corporate vanity. I realized the card hadn't been intercepted by my security team because they no longer flagged her as a high-level threat. To the digital eyes guarding this estate, she was no longer a predator. She was a ghost. I stood in the cold air, the crinkle of the cheap prison-grade cardstock loud in the silence. Unlike her previous manipulative letters, this one was short, lacking any financial demands or legal pleas. "Merry Christmas, Dad," it read. "Tell her the snow is pretty from here, too." Is she wearing her coat? I felt a momentary pang of the father. I used to be a ghost of a memory from a time when her love didn't have a price tag. A year ago, I would have burned this with a hand shaking from rage. Now, it was just paper. I folded it slowly, realizing that some distances can never be closed even by a stamp. 1 year, 1 card. 100,000 miles of emotional distance. I turned back toward the house, the soft, warm yellow glow of the Christmas tree lights visible through the sunroom windows. I stepped back into the warmth, the smell of pine needles and cinnamon cider, wrapping around me like a physical embrace. Briar, Eleanor, and Bernice were gathered around the tree, their laughter muffled and genuine. This wasn't the performative perfection of the previous year. It was the messy, honest reality of a family that had survived a war. Eleanor looked up, her eyes soft in the candlelight. "You were gone a long time at the mailbox, Thane," she said. "Everything all right?" I walked toward the mantel, looking at the golden lion painting that now hung prominently above the hearth. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be," Eleanor, I replied. The fireplace didn't just warm the room. It seemed to act as the heart of a house that finally had a pulse. I realized then that the greatest hostile takeover I ever achieved wasn't of a company or a trust, but the reclamation of my own soul from the hands of those who tried to price it. Briar ran over to me, handing me a small wrapped box. I opened it to find a handmade key to her sketchbook, a silent promise that I was the only person she trusted with her internal world. I placed her hand-drawn Christmas card on the mantel next to the lion. I looked at the 3 women I loved and then out at the falling snow, knowing that while the $31 million was gone into the foundation, I had never been a wealthier man in my entire life. I adjusted my tuxedo in the mirror of the sunroom, not to check for a target on my back, but to ensure I looked the part of a man who had finally turned his scars into armor for others. The piece I had found on that snowy Christmas morning had matured into something durable and bright. 6 months had passed since the trial ended, and tonight the Katherine Garrison Foundation was being honored at the Mint Museum uptown. I felt a profound sense of completeness as I smoothed the silk of my lapels. The $31 million that had once been the catalyst for my attempted murder was now the engine of a very different kind of takeover, one aimed at the legislative loopholes that allowed predators to thrive. I discovered just before leaving that the anonymous donor who had provided the final million for our coastal expansion was actually Bernice Hayes. She had used the last of her own savings to clear her conscience completely, a final act of penance for the monsters she had unwittingly helped raise. I didn't mention it when I met her at the gala. Some debts are best settled in the quiet of one's own soul. The museum smelled of expensive perfume and fresh floor wax, a sophisticated air that no longer felt suffocating. As I walked through the lobby with Eleanor Hayes on my arm, the true highlight wasn't the award I was about to receive. It was seeing Breyer's latest work, a massive mural titled "The Lion and the Jasmine," displayed prominently for Charlotte's elite to see. The vibrant colors and bold strokes were a far cry from the charcoal nightmares of a year ago. To a man who taught us that a legacy isn't inherited, it's defended, the presenter announced to a room filled with applause. I stepped to the podium, looking out at a city that had once whispered about my downfall, but now saw the Garrison name as a symbol of resilience. I didn't save the foundation, I told the crowd. The truth did. Award, applause, altruism. It was a long way from the ricin in the glass and the hidden ledgers of Myers Park. The morning after the gala, the transition from civic duty to personal liberation was seamless. We arrived at the private hangar at Charlotte Douglas International, the air cool and expectant. I watched Eleanor and Breyer pore over guidebooks for the Louvre and the Swiss Alps, their laughter harmonizing with the distant hum of the jet engines. I felt the heavy friction of the last year finally dissolve into the thin air of the upper atmosphere as we boarded. I realized that for 70 years I had been a collector of companies, but for the next 20, I would be a collector of sunsets. As we settled into the plush leather airplane seats, I sipped a glass of vintage champagne, the bubbles sharp and celebratory. I looked at Breyer, who was already staring out the window at the tarmac. "Grandpa, can I paint the Eiffel Tower, even if it's already been done?" she asked. "You paint it exactly how you see it," Breyer, I replied, handing her a small leather-bound sketchbook I had hidden in my carry-on. "Nobody sees the world the way you do." I told her then that this wasn't just a vacation sketchbook, but a record of a tour with no scheduled end. I had no plans to return to the office ever again. I watched the Carolina coastline fade into the blue of the Atlantic, knowing that while the ledger of my life was finally balanced, the most profitable chapters were the ones I was about to write in pencil. The soft morning light hitting a London hotel balcony years ago had been the start of a beautiful unscripted season, but time has a way of pulling a man back to his roots. I stood in my study at the Garrison estate, the air tasting of dust and old memories that had finally settled into a quiet stillness. Time had turned the jagged edges of my rage into a smooth, heavy stone, one I carried with me as I walked through the silent halls, listening for the echoes of ghosts that had finally stopped screaming. I had lived 1,000 lives since that flight over the Atlantic, yet the ledger was only now truly closing. I recently began anonymously funding the legal defense of inmates wrongly convicted of financial crimes, a quiet reversal of the greed that had once targeted my own pulse. It was the opposite of what Jessamine would have expected, and that brought me a clinical private satisfaction. The sharp clinical sound of the telephone ringing broke the silence of the afternoon. It was the news I had been expecting, though it didn't make the impact any less heavy. Bernice Hayes was gone. She was the final witness to the Vance conspiracy, the last person who remembered me as the man who almost died in his own dining room. I handled the arrangements with the surgical precision I once reserved for multi-billion-dollar mergers, but I found my hands moving with a newfound gentleness. Bernice is dead. Sterling is forgotten. The ledger is closing. Just as I hung up, the phone rang again, a different tone, a different world. It was a parole officer informing me that Jessamine was eligible for a hearing and asking if I wished to submit a statement. The shield I built for Briar still felt heavy in my hand, a moral weight that demanded a final decision. I was still processing the request when Briar walked into the study. She was no longer the small, flinching bird I had rescued. She was a young woman with the sharp, clear gaze of a strategist. The crisp white edges of a law school acceptance letter were visible in her bag, a testament to her own hard-won victory. She had traded her charcoal sketches for legal briefs, her trauma transformed into a sharp intellectual weapon. We stood in the library, the hollow echo of our footsteps on the hardwood floors, a reminder of how much space we no longer needed to fill with fear. "I don't want the house," Grandpa Briar said, her voice steady and devoid of the old tremors. "I want to sell it to the foundation permanently. I want the law to make sure nobody else has to hide under floorboards." I looked at her, feeling a surge of generational pride that made the $31 million seem like pocket change. "You've become the lion, Briar," I replied. "I'm just the one who kept the cage open." She smiled then, a radiant expression that outshone the morning sun, and revealed that her law school application essay had been about my hostile takeover of my own life. She saw my survival not as a tragedy, but as her primary inspiration for seeking justice. I felt the weight of a heavy brass key in my palm as I prepared to hand over the estate. As I watched the moving trucks haul away the last of the furniture from the old guest wing, I realized that the only thing left to settle was the final disposition of the man who started it all. The iron gates of the state penitentiary had looked much smaller when I drove past them last month, a shrinking monument to a decade of justice that no longer held any power over me. Today I stood among the jasmine vines Catherine once loved, realizing that while the $31 million was gone into the foundation, the air I breathed had never felt so rich. The scent of blooming jasmine and wet slate rose from the garden path, a fragrance of life and renewal that seemed to permeate the very stones of the estate. I performed a final mental audit of my soul, comparing the old man who obsessively checked for targets on his back to the man who stood here now vulnerable but unburdened. Through the sunroom window I watched Briar. She was hunched over her law books, her posture reflecting a strength that no longer needed a hidden floorboard for protection. Sterling had died in prison recently, a quiet headline in a back page I read once, and then discarded. He had become just another number in a state ledger, while I had successfully reclaimed my status as a grandfather. The hostile takeover was complete. I had finally acquired myself and my dignity. During these quiet years, I had made one final move to ensure the cycle of greed would never repeat. I quietly liquidated the very last of the Garrison family holdings, ensuring that the legacy was now purely a charitable entity. There is no private stock left for any future vultures to target. The Garrison name now belongs to the broken and the exploited, not the greedy. No poison, no ledgers, no lies. Just dinner. The amber glow of the setting, Charlotte's sun began to spill across the lawn, signaling the end of the day. Eleanor stepped onto the patio, her face bathed in the warm light of the evening. "Thane, dinner is ready." She called out, her voice a steady anchor in my peaceful world. I walked toward the house, my footsteps firm and rhythmic. We gathered at the mahogany table, the warmth of the dining room hearth, chasing away the autumn chill. As I poured a deep, perfectly aged Bordeaux untested and unfeared, the conversation flowed with Briar's aspirations for her first semester and Eleanor's shared warmth. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand finding mine with a familiar ease. "You look like a man who finally found what he was looking for." "Thane," she said softly. I smiled, feeling the clear weight of the crystal in my fingers. "I found out that the best deals are the ones where nobody has to lose their soul." I realized then that my 5K5 project, the frantic survival plan I had hatched in a cold sweat years ago, wasn't just about outliving my enemies. It was about learning how to live without them. The wealth wasn't the number in the account. It was the absence of fear at my own table. I reached for the silver bell and rang it once, the clear ringing sound of a crystal glass toast following soon after. I looked at the two women who represented my redeemed future, realizing the ledger of my life was finally perfectly balanced. I raised my glass, the crystal catching the setting sun, and for the first time in 70 years, I didn't look at the door to see who was coming. I looked at the table to see who stayed. Looking back now, I realized this journey was never just about anger or retaliation. It was a painful lesson about trust, dignity, and the danger of ignoring the warning signs in the people closest to us. What some might call a family revenge story became for me a moment of awakening. For years, I believed patience alone could hold a family together. I stayed silent when I should have spoken, and I tolerated things I should never have accepted. If I could give one piece of advice, it would be this: don't repeat my mistakes. Protect your dignity before resentment turns your life into another family revenge story. Many people might hear what happened and label it a family revenge story, but deep inside, I know it was about finally drawing a line. Life has shown me that age does not mean weakness. In many grandpa stories, older men are treated as if their time has passed, yet experience can become a powerful guide. My faith reminded me that even in dark moments, God can lead us toward clarity and strength. In the end, this experience felt like one of those grandpa stories where wisdom grows from pain. Perhaps that is why grandpa stories resonate so deeply. They remind us that courage and self-respect can still grow later in life. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in the narrator's position, facing such a painful family conflict? I'd truly value hearing your perspective. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. A small note: while inspired by difficult family themes, some elements were dramatized for storytelling purposes.